from his sheath and holding it as he had been asked to. And as his hands wrapped around the hilt, a wind seemed to come from somewhere to the south for a long moment, making the flames of the candles that lit the tent bend horizontally before returning to normal. Roriger looked about wildly as the wind struck, but then relaxed, and then his gaze reached Robert and he froze in his chair, his eyes widening. For a long moment he sat there and then he stood shakily. "Robert?" He asked the question in a low, uncertain voice. "Is that you? How can you be here? And so, changed?" He half raised a hand before his eyes for a moment. "It is you, but yet not you, in robes and with a sword, and your face," he froze. "Your face. You are older." "I am older indeed," he ground out through gritted teeth. "Looking back at you. Your sword, the clouds around you. I see lightning and hear thunder as if." Roriger's eye widened again. "You are the Storm King come again." He swallowed and then shook his head a little. "The Storm King. So I was wrong about that again. Prophecy wrongly interpreted by me. Again. Prophecy." He asked the word with a scowl. "About what?" I thought that the power of the storm was something that would follow the prince that was promised." "So, you are the Storm King." "I'm trying to become that." "You're looking back from when? Or where?" 16 years. I'm at the wall. The others are coming. Ned Stark has sent out the call." Roriger screwed his eyes shut. "Then I am dead." "That you are." "Robert, cousin. I am sorry. Everything I have touched has withered and died. I am sorry. So sorry. The realm is broken due to my foolishness and stupidity. I thought I was obeying prophecy. I was wrong. I should not have done what I did. And Lyanna, please tell me that she is at your side now." He took a deep breath. "No. She died." Roriger groaned deep in his throat and scrubbed at his eyes for a long moment with both hands. "How? You left her in a lonely tower in the Dornish marches, with 3 idiot king's guards without a clue about how to deal with a girl who was pregnant after you raped her. No maester. No midwife. She died of childbirth fever after giving birth to a son." And now Roriger moaned and sank to his knees on the rug on the floor, rocking with anguish before beating at the ground with his fists. After a long moment he looked back up at him, his face smeared with tears and anguish. "So I was wrong yet again." "You were." Roriger Targaryen ran a hand over his face and then he slowly stood and wiped the tears from his face. "What hope do you have now?" "Some. The realm rallies. The castles on the wall are being rebuilt. We will fight. Then tomorrow I must die." Roriger looked him in the eye, resolve building on his face. "Do not tell me how." "But I do I not?" "You did." "Will." "It was clean." "Then, again, I must." "Your Grace," the green man said softly, "step back. Take your hands off the hilt. He will see you fade." He nodded and did as he was told. Roriger's eyes widened again, as he looked about the tent, before nodding and then walking back to the table and picking up the letter from his daughter. "Barristan." There was an acknowledging shout and just before the Selmy from the past entered the tent Roriger ignited the letter from his daughter on a candle and then threw it into the nearest brazier. "My prince. My orders stand. We fight tomorrow. You and your brothers will command and fight where I have ordered you to. The army needs leaders. You must be those leaders. I will do what I need to. And there will be no discussion on this. I understand your objections. But my orders stand. I command it. No argument, Barristan. I command it." The face of the Selmy from the past worked for a long moment, but then he nodded sharply. "Very well, my prince. I will order it so, as you command." And with that he was gone, his white cape billowing behind him. Roriger strode over slowly to a side table and poured himself a large goblet of wine. "So, I die on the morrow," he said softly, before taking a large swallow. "As it must be." He held his goblet up. "Robert, save the realm." And then he drank again. The scene seemed to shiver and freeze, and then, suddenly, Robert was back at the heart tree, releasing his grip from the arm of the green man and then falling to his knees. Only then did he weep. Chapter 53. Chapter text. Willers. One of the first things that he had done after father had died was to have the message network redirected to the High Tower. There had long been a system of messaging from the coast of the Reach to High Garden, the High Tower and the Arbor against Ironborn raiding. Now it was informing of the progress of just one ship. Lord Stark will be here in a few days, he muttered and dropped the message onto the table by the window. There was a breeze coming through the window that made it quiver a little, and he placed a paperweight over it to prevent it from flying through the air and out of the doorway. Good, said grandfather, and he looked at him worriedly. There was something slightly off about him these past few days, as if he was coming to terms with something. Perhaps they all were. The blight was still out there, still spreading out from Old Town like a slow pestilence, and the weight of worry on him was ever present. Aunt Malora also worried him. She had always been high-strung, flighty, even fascinated by books of magic, or so he had been led to understand. Now she was a hollow-eyed wraith at the table, looking downcast and depressed as she leafed through a book about the High Tower. He had heard that she had had a tremendous argument with grandfather, with repeated shrieks of why. But no one knew what that argument had been about. I've doubled the guards, grandfather said eventually. Ned Stark must get here safely. Old Town is abuzz with rumors about all kinds of things, and I've had to stop people from suggesting the maddest of ways of dealing with the gate. Gods, our bloody ancestors. Willers raised an eyebrow at that, and Lord Hightower made a noise deep in his throat that was almost a snarl. Guard the gate, we were told. And we have. But so much has been lost, so much forgotten. We forgot what was behind it. Past High Towers built the High Tower stage by stage, and we even used Bran the Builder to build it higher, but at some point we forgot, or allowed Andor-like thinking to influence us. Andor-like thinking. Willers looked at grandfather, confused. Grandfather sighed and passed a hand over his lower forehead, as if wiping his anger away. The first men knew that the threat of the others had never gone away, not truly. And they knew that the drowned god's prison, or what amounted to it, had to be guarded. They were familiar with magic, magic in root and stone, which waxes and wanes like the moon. They thought differently, I think. They did not forget things. And then the Andals came, with their gods and their fears of other gods and their gods' damned religious fervor that meant that things they did not understand had to be destroyed. They burned the Weirwoods, slaughtered the children of the forest, killed those who dared to disagree. And the High Towers of the time did not do enough to stop them. The children helped to create the gate, and where are the children now, now that we need them in our hour of need? Dead. Gone. Grandfather was roaring now, red-faced and furious. How much could we have remembered if they had still been out there, waiting in their gods' woods? Ready to give advice. Able to warn us. Grandfather gestured at other Bane. The first men made that with the help of the children of the forest. You are still finding out what it can do. We know. Father. Malora said the word in a dead flat voice, almost a voice of warning. It was a word that finally made the blood drain from grandfather's face. He clenched his fists for a long moment and then leant against the window with a sigh. Baylor will do what he can to quiet the city. Gods, I wish we still had vigilance. Willers, we have found a treatise on other Bane. It is in the language of the first men, and it is obscure even then. You must study it. After all, you were born to wield it. He looked at grandfather, and unease rippled through his skin for a moment. Where is it? Here. Aunt Malora held a slim book out, and he shuddered slightly at the look in her eyes. There was a combination of emotions there that puzzled him. Was it outrage? Anger? Some form of grief? Or was it pure and simple madness? He took it and opened it, frowning down at the runes. Yes, this was obscure indeed. He would have to study this carefully. There is something else, grandfather said in a voice that made him look at him at once with alarm. You should tell me at once if your dreams darken. There might be a reason for that. He frowned at that. The tale from Winterfell about the mountain. About his possession. You think that I am in danger of that? Oddly enough, grandfather looked at Malora rather than him, a long glance filled with twitches of the eyebrow on both of their parts before grandfather sighed a little. Not quite. It's hard to explain. I fear that something dark is coming, something that is racing Ned Stark. What it is uncertain. There are many interpretations. Gods, it's hard to even explain it. Triple the gods. Aunt Mallory said the words in that same dead flat voice. Almost in resignation. We must be sure on this. Sure on what? Willers asked the question with narrowed eyes. They were not telling him something. But what? The avalanche is on us, the stones can no longer vote, grandfather said, sounding as if he was quoting someone. And then he looked up. The moment that Ned Stark gets here, we escort him to the gate. Do you understand? After a long moment he nodded. I do. Grandfather's eyes seemed to search his face for a long moment. Good, he said eventually. I'm proud of you, my boy. So proud of you. Renly. The best way to deal with the god's awful stench in the alcove of the passageway was to breathe through the mouth and not through the nose, and concentrate on something, anything, that was not related to the smell, like the rope that was hanging from the trestle over the opening, the way that the shadows inside the shaft that went downwards moved as the lantern was used to inspect the grisly bottom of said shaft, and the hatch that normally kept the alcove safe and the stench down, because it looked old but very well made. After a while the light started to come up as the man in the shaft climbed out of it one-handed, using his feet as well on the knotted rope. As he reached the top he placed the lantern by the side and levered himself up and out, before wiping his forehead. God, said Pate Waters in a tired and horrified voice. It's worse than we thought, my lord. The short servant had been acting as his permanent man in the Red Keep for some years, being very quiet and very observant. Renly wordlessly handed over a skin of watered wine and allowed Pate the time to take a large swallow of it and then visibly compose himself. Worse. There must be 20 to 30 of them down there, my lord. From the clothing they were servants and a few guards. Lannister guards, I might add, based on the cloaks and the armor. The oldest ones are, well, there's a lot of muck and filth and bones. And the newest? There were 2 I recognized, my lord, barely. One was a serving girl, Ella by name. Sweet young thing, very bad at knocking on doors before opening them. I fear that's why she's down there with her throat cut, I think. There's a guard next to her. Timon. She vanished 10 days before his grace took the royal family north to Winterfell, and he disappeared 2 days after that. He shook his head. Timon. I remember him being smug about something before he vanished. Smug for a month or 2, I think. She used him to kill and he must have thought he'd be rewarded, Renly surmised. How did he die? Head's bashed in and there's a blood stain on the wall of the shaft. I think he was hit, fell, killed in the fall when he hit stone going down, my lord. Renly. The call was from far away down the passageway and Renly turned his head. Down here. Then he stood and helped Pate to stand. All right, get that rope up and move that trestle. We need to get that hatch closed before the stink spreads further. Aye, my lord. As Pate got to it, Renly stepped out into the passageway, taking a gulp of watered wine himself, and then peered to see who was approaching. After a moment he blinked in surprise at the approaching shape of a tall, old man with silver hair. Uncle Eldon. Lord Eldon Estermont had seen close to 70 years come and go, but he was still quite hale and hearty right up until the moment he smelled the stench and stopped dead in his tracks, one hand going over his nose. Gods, Renly, what is that stink? My unbeloved former good sister's work, Renly said bitterly as he gestured into the alcove, where Pate was now closing the hatch with some relief. His grandfather joined him to watch. It's a former privy blocked off now and unused since the Dance of Dragons, if I have it right. I don't understand. The Kingslayer's full confession finally came in from Winterfell. He mentioned that Cersei would have those servants who walked in on their cavorting dealt with. I found myself wondering how they were dealt with. He pointed down to the end side of the passageway. There's a set of stairs there that go up to a good thick door that comes out near her old quarters. Unused since before Summerhall, I think. Until Cersei discovered it. There's footprints in the dust. Drag marks too. By all the gods, how many? Pate. The servant bobbed his head at Uncle Eldon. At least 20, my lord. Perhaps 30. Hard to tell as it's pretty bad at the bottom. Uncle Eldon pulled a face. The murderous whore. She always thought herself more important than anyone else, Renly replied, looking at the hatch. Well now. Pate. My lord. Hire 10 men in the city. Warn them ahead that this is a horrible messy job, but tell them that it's worth a dragon each if they complete the job of emptying the shaft of bodies. They can work in shifts of 2 to spread the load. Get them to at least try and identify the bodies. Alert the Silent Sisters too. I want the bodies treated with respect. However they died, they didn't deserve this. Tell the men that we'll replace any clothing that get ruined by what's at the bottom of that shaft, and that we'll provide washing facilities and food. I want it done, and I want it done right. Understand? Pate nodded and bowed, before striding off. How did no one smell this place? Uncle Eldon said in horrified amazement. The hatch is a snug fit and this section is unused, Renly replied tiredly. And what's one more stench in a city of them? Now, Uncle Eldon, you don't often leave Greenstone. What's amiss? The old man directed a long and very level look at him, making his heart sink a little. Renly, we need to talk somewhere private. Where I cannot be overheard. He took Uncle Eldon to one of the rooms that he'd identified as not being filled with odd alcoves or strange holes in the ceiling where someone could eavesdrop on whoever was inside. Even then, he still looked about carefully. Varys was still Varys. Uncle Eldon watched him with a little bemusement that ebbed after he quietly told him why he was checking. After Renly was finished checking the room, he raised an eyebrow at his uncle, who sighed and ran a hand over his forehead for a moment, before looking his nephew in the eye. Renly, you need to marry, and marry quickly. He didn't groan, as this was something that he had been expecting. I know, uncle, he said after a moment. Jon Arryn has also talked to me, and I know that I must marry. I have been talking to prospective matches for the past few months. Months? Are you close to a choice? No, he was not, although he had been hawking with Lord Kellington and his daughter Bethany, and he found her pleasant to talk to and remarkably proficient with the bow for a woman. But he had not taken things any further, as he thought he had to search more. He had to admit, now, that he had been procrastinating. Not yet, he admitted. Perhaps soon. Uncle Eldon scowled. Choose quickly, wed her, bed her, get a child in her. He stared at his uncle. Why the rush, Uncle Eldon? Boy, you should have a wife already at your age. A gnarled fist hit the table next to him. And then he sighed. Renly, your Stormlords are. I will not say restless. I will simply say that they are talking. Talking of what? Many things. Legends. The Long Night. Robert finding the Durandon tombs and Stormbreaker, they talk a lot about that. I know, you were there for that as well, but they talk of Robert, not you. There is talk of things waking up, old things, old traditions. The call is not questioned in the Stormlands, not with those cages going around with bits of whites in them. Your Stormlords know that we are about to fight a terrible war on the wall. They know that after so many years of summer an equally long winter is to come. Uncle Eldon sighed. My sons are getting Greenstone ready, and Estermont as a whole. And there is a lot of talk in the Stormlands about succession. Most houses are being sensible and settling disputes. A few are being idiots. I heard about Piglot trying to get one over Kellington and failing. But most are trying to settle their differences. And there are marriage alliances being forged all over the place. There is talk of heirs and spares. And you have no heir. There is no child in Storm's End, and there needs to be. You need a canny wife to run Storm's End and a child at her breast. People are talking. He nodded tiredly. I will make a decision soon, uncle. But Uncle Eldon did not seem satisfied. Renly, I must be blunt. People are talking about many things. Some say that they wish that Robert was still at Storm's End, as he has done so much. Others that they wish that Stannis was there, as he held it against all odds. I know, this is unfair, you have not had a chance yet to be tested in war. But you are very much in Robert's shadow in this. Stormbreaker has gotten so many people talking. That stung more than a bit, but he was man enough to realize that was not the fault of his brothers. I understand. Then he saw the look on the face of his uncle. What else? There is talk, whispers in the wind for the most part, but as I am your uncle there are times when people see me approach and change the subject abruptly, which makes me wonder of a loyal petition to the king to have one of his legitimized bastards, namely Edric, made your heir until you can produce one of your own. Bewilderment turned rapidly to rage and he bounded to his feet in a trice. What? No. How dare they? That would be without precedent. That is an insult. Who says that, Uncle Eldon? Who? His face was flushed and he could feel the famous Baratheon rage starting to overwhelm him. How dare they indeed? I will not tell you, as I would not condemn a man for a rumor of a whisper. Uncle Eldon snapped back at him coldly. Sit down, boy, and think. Trembling with rage, Renly sat down after a long moment, still ready to flip the table over and break a chair against the nearest wall. They dare, Renly, because some doubt if you can produce an heir at all. There is talk of you and Loras Tyrell. You might have thought you were being discreet when you were with him. You were not. People are talking. Just rumors at the moment, but those rumors are spreading. And I must be blunt here. You are my nephew and I love you dearly, but you are also my Lord Paramount and I must provide you with the best counsel that I can give. People are wondering if, in this time, with a war against the others coming on the wall, with a second long night coming, if a sword-swallowing pillowbitter can lead the Stormlands. The rage vanished in the blink of an eye as the shock overtook him. Who knew? When had someone seen them? Heard them? What should he do? What could he do now? Your silence says volumes, Uncle Eldon said eventually in a tired voice. So it is true then. He struggled to speak for a long moment. Uncle. Save your words. You must act now. With every day that passes without you acting, that loyal petition idea will gain strength. Put aside your position here and go home. Marry quickly. She must be a Stormlander and the marriage must be at Storm's End. There must be a bedding and after it you must stay in her bed enough to father the first of many children. Uncle Eldon looked at him with understanding and sympathy in his eyes. If you can father a bastard or two here and there, even better. Yes, boy, it's a mama's farce. But it will secure the loyalty of the Stormlands in the greatest storm that it has faced in thousands of years. You must be a leader now. The leader that the Stormlands needs. Put your needs aside and listen to the voice of duty. You cannot be selfish anymore. You are a Baratheon of Storm's End and you need an heir born from your balls. And Loras Tyrell must never be seen with you again. Afterwards he could not say when it was that Uncle Eldon left the room. Was it a moment, or an hour? All he knew was that he sat there, in that room, staring at the wall opposite him. Thinking about so many things. And then, after that undefined period, he stood and strode out of the room and back to his own quarters. Once he was there he closed the door and sat at his desk for a long moment, before looking at the nearby fireplace. It had the materials for a fire next to it and he knelt by it and recalled his lessons before starting to lay the kindling at the bottom and then the larger pieces of wood and then a few others. A splash of lamp oil and a stub of lighted candle got the fire started. Only then did he sit down at his desk and pull out a pair of intricate keys. The first unlocked a secret compartment of his desk, which slid out to reveal a slim box. The second unlocked the box, which opened to reveal the letters inside. They were letters that he could not bring himself to destroy. Letters that Loras had sent him, through various confidential ways. Letters of intimacy, of treasured words, of love. Love. He fingered them in silence, unable to open any of them, and reread the words on the pages. After a while he willed his hands to stop their shaking and picked the letters up, before standing and taking them to the fire, where he paused for a long moment and then he thrust them into the flames. As the paper caught and crackled and burned he wiped the tears from his cheeks and then closed his eyes for a long and anguished moment. When he opened them again he could see the ashes dancing at the grate, almost mocking him. And then, finally, he undid the chain at the back of his neck and let the signet ring with the worn crest tumble into his hand. It had been father's ring. His last one of his very few memory of his father had been him handing his old signet ring to him for protection before he and mother had left for their fruitless mission to Essos to find a bride for Roger. He had another one, of course, the one that Robert had made after their parents had died in Shipbreaker Bay, because father's had not fit his huge fingers, but that had never really fit Renly's fingers. The old one did, now. He looked at it for a long moment. And then he went back to his desk. He needed to meet Bethany Kellington again. He did not know what was there between them. But he would make it work. The Stormlands needed an heir. Eamon. By the time the king finally fell silent and leant back in his chair, Stormbreaker propped against the table to one side, Eamon had closed his eyes and then placed a trembling hand over them. Robert Baratheon's tale of what he had seen, thanks to the Green Man, at the Ruby Ford so many years ago had obviously deeply affected him. Eamon, I don't know what to say, the king said eventually. I have hated Rhaegar Targaryen for so long, for what he and his father did, that now, knowing that it was only talking to me that drove him to his death, I have no words. What can I say? It sounds like madness. He thought back to Egg, so many years ago, and his letters bemoaning his elevation to the Iron Throne, as well as his own sorrows from the news of the rebellion. You have closed a circle you were not aware of, Your Grace, he said sorrowfully. You have done what you had to. What, perhaps, you were born to. The gods can be cruel at times, and merciful as well. Rhaegar, he thought he had interpreted prophecy correctly, when he had not. These things are difficult to interpret, hard to understand. You did the right thing. As he opened his eyes again he could see that the king was staring at the fire. After a long moment the younger man smiled a bitter smile. I never thought that I'd ever say that I felt sorry for Rhaegar Targaryen. And I could not tell him what else lay ahead. That letter from his daughter. That poor little scrap. She wrote to him of her cat. And I killed him, before she was murdered by Tywin Lannister's men. She didn't deserve that. You did what had to be done, he replied tiredly. And you could not have known what Tywin Lannister intended. Revenge, for him, is something personal. And wide. There was a silence in the room for a long moment, before the king nodded. You have that right. He rubbed at his forehead for a moment and then swept that large hand across his face and sighed. Lyanna told me, in Winterfell, that I had to set things aside to become the Storm King. Her shade, her ghost, call it what you will, gods, whoever would have thought I'd be saying such things and not being taken for a madman. Eamon shook his head a little. There are forces at work here that we cannot fathom, not yet. Who knows what our ancestor Daenerys the Dreamer foresaw? Two lines were combined within your blood, Durrandon and Baratheon, reinforced with more Targaryen. The Durrandon line seems to be coming to the fore, but do not forget that you too are descended from Daenerys. Who knows what the blending has created? You will be a Storm King alike and yet unlike your ancestors of Storm's End. You must not hold back. Embrace what you feel. Lead us. There was a long moment of silence and then Robert Baratheon, the king, nodded slowly. You speak wisely, great uncle. I'll think on what you said. I have to. Another silence, and then, gods, I should have talked to you before. Asked you south or come to the north myself. Foolish of me not to. My bloody pride. You were angry, he replied with a sigh. And anger can fester at times. Deepen. Become poisonous. And you were married then to a woman whose father takes grudges rather seriously. The king laughed softly at his words. That's putting it lightly. Caste Maria. Someone knocked on the door and they both looked over. Enter. Robert barked, and the door opened to reveal Sir Barristan Selmy, who was holding a message. Your Grace, this has arrived from Winterfell. The king took the proffered message with a nod to the Lord Commander of the King's Guard and then looked at it, his eyebrows flying up as he read it. Oh my, he said dryly and then passed it over to him. As he read it he could feel his own eyebrows rising as well. The king rubbed his chin and then called, Sir Barristan. The door opened again. Your Grace. Could you please send word for Lord Umber and Mance Rayder to come here at once? I shall send word at once, Your Grace. As the door closed again the king rose to his feet and strode about the room for a turn before chuckling slightly. Gods. I wonder what Ned would say of this. I think that he would say that it would strengthen the North at a time when it needs all the help it can get, Your Grace. The younger man paused to mull that over and then grinned and nodded. You have that right. After a short time they both heard boots on floorboards outside and then a loud knock. The king smiled at him and then raised his voice, Enter. Great John Umber strode in first, followed by the former king beyond the wall, both of whom bowed before their king, the latter slightly more flamboyantly than the former. "Your Grace," Raider said formally, "you sent for us." The king nodded and then stood, before looking at them both with a slightly quizzical smile on his face. I did. Word has come from Winterfell. Lord Umber, young Ned Umber has arrived there, escorted by Mors Umber." The Great John looked pleased but also a little confused by that. "Oh, good news." Indeed, but Mors Umber was able to confirm something once he arrived there. A party of wildlings free folk arrived. And one of them was Rowan Umber, the daughter of Mors. The Lord of the Last Hearth stood there, genuinely stunned. Finally he found the words to say, "Truly. Rowan." The king said with a certain something in his voice. "And he has acknowledged his granddaughters Dalla and Val." He looked at the equally gobsmacked Mance Raider. "I believe that you are married to Dalla." The two men eyed each other and he could see that Great John Umber was in two minds as to if he should laugh or swear violently. "I remember Rowan Umber well," the Lord of the Last Hearth rumbled. "She was taken by a bloody wilderling. Taken against her will. If that means that." "Peace," Raider said, throwing his hands up. "I know the tale of Rowan, although she left out the facts about her birth. The man who stole her and took her north of the wall was not the father of Dalla or Val. The man who took her made the mistake of letting his guard down around Rowan and she castrated him and stuffed his cock and balls down his throat, killing him. The father of Dalla and Val was Quinn, a good man who won her heart. They were married before a heart tree." He winced a little. "He was killed fighting the others. I made sure he'd never rise again afterwards." There was a strained silence. Then the Great John nodded. "Good." He looked at Raider. "And when you married my cousin, was it before a heart tree?" "It was," Raider said firmly. "I made sure of that. Marriage customs amidst the free folk vary a lot, but I knew that I had to do it right." The king looked at them both and then nodded sharply, before looking at the message. "Good. Robb Stark writes that he requests that I make it clear that Dalla and Val are of House Umber, further binding the North and the free folk together. I agree and declare it so. Anyone want to challenge that?" The Great John and Raider both hurriedly shook their heads. "Excellent, as it looks as if Robb Stark has his eye on Val Umber. After all, they both faced that attack by the mountain. Lord Umber, would you object to being linked by marriage to House Stark?" "Gods, never," Lord Umber said. "It would be a very great honor." "Then Maester Eamon, I need to send a message to Winterfell if you please." "I will prepare one at once," he smiled, wondering a little at the chain of circumstances that had come together for this. "One moment first, you must witness something." "Raider, kneel." The king stood, a great tall presence that seemed to fill the room with something on his face that made the former king beyond the wall go pale and then go down on one knee. Robert Baratheon reached out, pulled Stormbreaker from its scabbard and touched Raider lightly on both shoulders. "Rise, Lord Raider. You have served all of Westeros well. You have saved your people, helped the North, repaired relations between the North and the free folk and bloody well earned your title. Ned Stark should be the one doing this, but he's not here and I am. He'll sort out the details when he gets back, but know this now, you have done well." Raider seemed to be wrestling some great emotion as he bowed his head and then stood almost shakily. As he seemed to fight to find the words he needed to say, Great John Umber strode to one side, poured out 4 goblets of wine and then handed them out, starting with the king. "This isn't ale, but it'll do. Welcome, good cousin. Treat Dalla badly and I'll have words to say." He chuckled, as did the others in the room, and they toasted the matter. It was not a fine wine, but it was better than he had been used to and would suffice. But then, as he prepared to go and send that message to Winterfell, there was the sound of hurried boots outside, raised voices and then a rap on the door that opened at the king's command to reveal Sir Barristan with another man who was holding a message. There was a red thread attached to it. "A message for His Grace the King, from the Lord Hand. Marked most urgent." The king waved a hand and the men bowed quickly, handed it over and then stepped back. There was a moment of silence and then the king looked up, his eyes wide and his mouth open. "Fetch the Lord Commander, Lord Lannister and his brothers, the Green Man, Sir Bryden Tully, Brian of Tarth, Lord Tarly and Lords Royce and Redfort at once. Go, man." The messenger bowed hastily and then ran out as the king looked about the room. "We need a map. My lords, Maester Eamon, the others have attacked Pike. According to Stannis they failed. There were 3 of them and many whites, in an iceberg of all things. By all the gods, has this ever happened before?" Ice seemed to flow through his veins for a moment and then he shook his head. "I do not recall reading of such an attack of that kind," he said in a voice like iron. "But Lady Mormont did say that something had been happening off the frozen shore. Freezing fog, as I believe she put it." He walked as fast as he could over to a bookshelf, perused it briefly and then pulled out a map, which he unrolled on the table. The others joined him there and Raider hissed as he looked at the map. "So far south. But they failed. They failed." The king stared down at the message again. "Gods, this is strange." And then he frowned slightly. "Wait, there's 2 messages here." The second message, again with a red thread, was pulled out and he stared at it. Hurried boots approached again outside and then the Lannisters arrived, bowing and curious, followed by the Lord Commander and the others. "My lords," the king rumbled, "word has come from Pike. The others attacked there. They failed, but Balon Greyjoy is dead, him and his brother, killed by their kinslaying brother. Asha Greyjoy is now Lady of the Iron Islands, acknowledged as such by the Lord Hand and myself." There was a moment of utter stillness and then Tywin Lannister strode forward and took the first message from the proffered hand of the king. "Gods," he said, sounding genuinely shocked. "The others at Pike." He narrowed his eyes and stared at the message. "From the date of this, wait, no word has come yet of any other attack. We had a raven from Shadow Tower this morning, saying all was well there," the Lord Commander rumbled as he took the proffered message from the Lord of the Westerlands. "And word from Bear Island just yesterday that all was well." He paused and his eyes seemed to go somewhere in thought. "Wait, when Mage was here, she spoke of strange mists off the frozen shore, mists that moved southwards. Could that have been this?" "It must have, surely. If they can outflank the wall." Lord Tarly sounded as if he was deep in thought. "Wait. Why Pike? Why now?" "Your Grace, my lords, this makes no sense." The king held out the second message. "This hints at an answer. Balon Greyjoy and his religious lunatic of a brother Damfair were killed by their own brother, Euron. He literally vanished after the attack, but Stannis writes that Euron Greyjoy's ship was discovered and that a thing was found on it by Asha Greyjoy and Jon Stark. Some abomination of bone and flesh and blood. Foul magic of some kind. They and others escaped it and burned the ship down around it." The room was silent after he said those words. Brian of Tarth swapped a worried gaze with the Blackfish, whilst Geryon Lannister looked absolutely horrified. And then the Green Man stepped forwards, took the second message from the hand of the king and read it in full before handing it to Tywin Lannister, who read it as if it had personally offended him. But it was Geryon Lannister that the Green Man turned to face. "You once battled a flesh smith, I think, from the sound of it. And as you said, if you could make it into the Smoking Sea by being careful, then so could others. Euron Greyjoy is a man of foul reputation. I wonder he might have picked up from his travels. And now, it seems, he has allied himself with the others." "But why?" Geryon Lannister said, bafflement in his voice. "Why ally with the others? All they offer is death." "He might seek to use them," Tywin Lannister said softly. "The message says that he intends to kill the drowned god. And, if he has indeed been to Valyria, then, well, who is to say that what came out of that cursed place was still entirely human? There are terrible tales of that place." Eamon nodded. "After the Doom, many tried to go there and secure it. Few if any ever returned, and those that did either spoke of madness or were unable to speak anything at all. Lord Lannister is right, we must assume that Euron Greyjoy is not as we all are. Not now. Warning has gone to Old Town." The king said each word heavily. "Ned will be warned. He'd better be warned." He looked at the map for a long moment and then straightened up. The attack on Pike might be a one-off, or it might be a precursor to a general outflanking of the wall. Warning of the western shore of the north has been sent out. Winterfell should be aware by now. The coastlines of the Riverlands and the Westerlands must also be warned. The Vale too. The king turned to Gia Mormont. "Lord Commander Mormont, how goes the refurbishment of the castles on the wall?" There are parties of builders and volunteers working on all of them now. Some are approaching decent shape. Some are still needing a lot of work. Create a list of what needs to be done to each castle and how urgent each one is. My lords, we must work harder than we have ever worked before on this. We must hold the wall and be prepared for anything from now onwards. Call on whatever you can for this. I will send ravens today calling for yet more help. The realm stands or falls here, at the wall. They are coming for us. We'll spit in their face and deny them every inch of ground. So say I. What say you? So say we all. So say we all, your grace. The bellow filled the room, and as it did there was the crack of lightning and thunder right above their heads, that made the room almost shake. Stannis. He had to admit, begrudgingly, that the Ironborn could sail. They were beating down towards Great Wyk, almost in the teeth of a hard westerly wind that some crews would have had trouble with. Not the crews of the little three-ship squadron that they were on. He also had to think that Asha Greyjoy would make a very good ruler of the Iron Islands. She might have been a Greyjoy, but she was free of her father's grasping malice and inability to admit when he was wrong, as well as the madness of two of her uncles and the brutal stolidity of the other. No, she took after her mother's family more than her father's. Which nothing but good for the Iron Islands after all the mistakes that her father and his siblings had made. She was clever, knew when to admit that she was mistaken about something and had a voice that could outbellow fools like Lord Dunstan Drum, who had sailed from old Wyk with his sons and then arrived at Pike with a pompous speech about how the Ironborn would never follow a mere slip of a girl. Well, that slip of a girl had stared at the pompous fool as he droned on, a stare so hard and pointed that Drum's sons and followers quite quickly fell silent in their support for Drum, not that he had seemed to notice at first. When he did, he faltered, and then Asha Greyjoy had stood and proceeded to tear Drum to verbal pieces, in the way that the Robert of a year ago might have demolished a roast boar. By the end he'd almost felt sorry for the man, who had been reduced to a red-faced state of humiliation, unable to match the power of her voice or the fact that, as she said, she was giving him one chance to be silent before she ordered his throat be cut. Stannis had then stood, nodded at Asha Greyjoy, and then simply said, as the Hand of the King, I can say that the Iron Throne recognizes Asha Greyjoy as the ruler of the Iron Islands. Her father willed it, the reader supports her, the Iron Throne supports her, House Stark supports her, and House Baratheon of Dragonstone supports her. Drum had stared at him, looking like a man who had totally miscalculated everything, whilst his sons had looked as if they wanted the ground to open up and swallow them. And that had been that they had all but slunk from the room, glaring a little at Ygritte Stark's comment that Drum was a pompous fart, all stink and dribble. He'd been impressed by her then, and he'd also seen the way that Theon Greymist had watched his sister as she had gone about the work of ruling at Pike. He had known that the boy could be prone to boastfulness and bragging, and after hearing the terrible tale of the future that Robb Stark had seen, he'd wondered why the Starks now trusted him, the man who had captured Winterfell in that other future and possibly killed Brandon and Rickon Stark. But that Theon Greyjoy was gone. In his place was Theon Greymist, someone who seemed to think a great deal before he did things. There were times when he could see him opening his mouth with a sly smile to perhaps make a jape, or suggest something off the top of his head and then pause, rethink and change direction from where he had been going. He knew that the boy had been told what he had done in that other future and that he had been horrified by it all. Ned Stark had had a huge impact on the former heir to the Iron Islands. And now the call and Robb Stark's tale had also had an impact. Theon Greymist was not Theon Greyjoy, not anymore. Well now. It remained to be seen where the lad would go from here. Someone hailed the ship from one of the other vessels, and he looked over to see that the reader was gesturing to one side. Ah! Great Wyk could be seen, a small shape on the horizon partially shrouded from view by sea mist. He had not seen it since Balon Greyjoy's foolish rebellion, which had cost the Ironborn so dearly. He had been surprised when Asha Greyjoy had announced that she was travelling there, but then he had heard that she had almost been summoned there by a message from the Stonerbrows, the leaders of those who had hidden their worship of the old gods on the Iron Islands. Elys Stonebrow was apparently dying, and she wanted to see Asha at once. Given the nature of the rupture that had divided the Iron Islands so badly, he could see why the trip was necessary. Orders were roared from various throats, and he looked up to see that pennants were being hoisted on all three ships. All were flying the flag of the Greyjoys, but now the ship he was standing on was also flying Asha Greyjoy's personal standard, whilst the right-hand ship was flying that of the reader. As they tacked into the great bay of the island and started to approach the little harbour that he could see that they were steering towards, he could also see that there was a crowd gathering there. Perhaps someone with keen eyes or a Mirish spyglass had seen them approach, but they did not seem to be hostile. And then as they docked and the various passengers assembled on the decks of the various ships, he could almost feel the mood of the crowd shift from caution to cautious hope and then to something else when they caught sight of first the direwolves and then the green cloak and horned hood of the green man who had accompanied them. Alwyn of the Isle of Faces was standing there on the deck, a silent figure with a knapsack with a pot containing a weirwood tree sapling at his feet. He eyed the crowd, wondering what they were thinking. The last time he had been to Great Wyk it had been to conquer it, during Balon Greyjoy's doomed rebellion. He'd been responsible for the deaths of many on the island. But now, as he came to think about it, none of them had been Stonerbrows. At the time he'd thought that parts of the island had merely acknowledged the reality of the situation, of the overwhelming power that the Iron Throne could bring to bear against the Iron Islands. He wasn't so sure now. What was especially interesting were the murmurs rising from the crowd. Stark was one of the words on many lips, the call were other words, and then Green Man. There was something in the air, not dangerous but something that he could not describe or define. As the gangplank thumped down and Asher Greyjoy's guards and crew flowed down it, he could see her almost twitching with impatience to be ashore again, and then she was off, striding down and then looking at the crowd, before smiling slightly. Benjen Stonerbrow, Ned Stonerbrow. I take it that your mother still lives. She does, the older of the men said, and Stannis looked them over. They were hawk-nosed, dressed in browns and greens with a badge embroidered on their tunics of a white tree on a red background. She has little time left though. You must see her at once. The Green Man and the others too. Things happened rapidly after that. Horses had been brought for them and he paused to wonder as to why there were the exactly correct number for their party. And then they rode up the long hill, banners snapping in the wind. The Stonerbrows led them to a long house made of stone and timber with a roof that seemed to have been retiled recently. There were more guards at the doorway that they strode through, and he noticed their livery again. The Stonerbrows seemed to be stronger in numbers and in influence than Asher Greyjoy had said, and he could see the same realization on her face. And then they came to the room where Elise Stonerbrow lay on a bed, a white-haired shrunken figure. Yes, she was dying. But as Asher Greyjoy approached where she lay, she opened her eyes and then smiled a smile with a remarkable number of teeth for a woman of her age. I knew you would come. I dreamt it. She paused and then seemed to gather her remaining strength. My lord, Asher Greyjoy, ruler of the Iron Islands. Long may you rule. Long will you rule. Asher Greyjoy looked at her before nodding choppily, tears in her eyes, before she went over and knelt by the bed. You told me to come. So I came. Is there nothing? The old woman shook her head and ran her hand down Asher Greyjoy's face. No, nothing. As I told you, death comes as an old friend to take the pain away. But, there are things that must be done first. She looked at Theon Greymist, whose face was white with strain. Theon, come here. The lad approached and knelt next to his sister. Old Graham. I remember you, and you have done the right thing. Never forget that. You chose the North. You were right to. You have killed whites. You saw what must be done and you have turned away from that boastful, vain, empty other self that you could have been. Never forget that. Never. It must become your strength. A gnarled finger jabbed at his chest. And then, as if tired, she leant back before looking at Jon Stark. You made a good marriage, my boy. A good woman. Your children will be strong. Remember what you are, remember your heritage. It will be important in the war on the wall. I will, Jon Stark said, looking strained. Thank you. There was a pause and then the old woman looked at the Green Man. We have waited a long time for you. Alwyn nodded. Yes. And now your wait is over. She shifted in her bed and looked out of the window for a moment. There was a heart tree near here once. My ancestors chopped it down to appease a drowned man who would have killed them otherwise. I am sorry. You should not be. Your ancestors did what they had to stay safe. The drowned god is a jealous god. A dying god. I know. Alwyn smiled a little. The roots are still there. They have always been there, deep in the soil. They were waiting. Deep roots are not touched by the frost. They hid just as you did. There was a moment of stunned silence. And then Elis Stonebrow slowly and painfully sat up in bed and grasped the hand of the green man. "What are you saying?" Alwyn patted her hand for a moment and then unslung the rucksack from his back and held it in front of him so that she could, with trembling fingers, touch the red leaves and white bark of the sapling. "Give me a few minutes outside. And a spade. I know where to dig. Benjen." The old woman snapped the word with a voice of command. "Give him what he needs." The two men departed, and as they did so Elis Stonebrow laboriously started to pull the sheets aside. "Asher, help me up. Ned, give me a knife, a sharp one." As she stood, supported by Asher Greyjoy and dressed in her white robes, she smiled a little. "I hoped of this. I dreamt once of this." And then she was hobbling towards the door, where she waited for a moment. When the door opened again it was to reveal Alwyn of the Isle of Faces, who bowed to the old woman respectfully and then led her out into the sunshine. People were muttering in awe to one side, and as he followed them out he realized why. The weirwood tree had been planted in a spot well away from the building, and it seemed to have shot up in size at least 6 feet and grown in girth. He gaped at it, and then he heard Elis Stonebrow sigh in contentment. "I dreamt of this once." She knelt at the foot of the tree. "Thank you. The roots were always there. Your family and others never forgot. The old gods remembered. As did the tree. Thank you again." She laid a hand on the trunk of the tree. "Ned. Mother. Give it to me." The man handed the knife over to his mother. And then she drew the knife over her palm without displaying any sign of pain before placing the blooded palm over the trunk of the weirwood tree. "Old gods, hear me now. We were faithful. We were true. We hid in the darkest of times. But we did not forget. We will never forget. So take what little I have left and use it to fight the others." And with that Elis Stonebrow stiffened and then fell to the ground, lifeless. And as he looked at the tree it seemed to grow upwards, and what might have been the beginnings of a face formed on the trunk of the tree. Robb. He felt almost as if he was hiding here, in this passageway, sitting opposite the strange doorway that he hadn't been able to open yet. There was so much to do, what with father being away in the Reach and the king being at Castle Black. He thought about Val for a moment and then closed his eyes for a long moment before forcing them open again. He had to wait until a raven came back from Castle Black, from the king and also the Great John. He had to plan this out and not be impulsive. He wanted her and he knew that she wanted him, but the last time he'd thought with his cock instead of his brain he'd ended up with crossbow bolts in his chest and then a knife in his heart. So he had to be more clinical about this. Was that the word? He'd heard Tyrion use it once. Hopefully he had that right. He closed his eyes and watched once again into grey wind so that he could stare at the mysterious door in the wall opposite them both, drinking in every detail, and then he jumped back again and then sketched a few more details of the door on the piece of paper he'd pinned to the corkboard on his lap. Yes, he hadn't imagined it. The handprints in the middle of the door were different. They were smaller, with just 3 fingers and a thumb. They were for a child of the forest. "It always sends a slight chill through me when you do that," said a voice to one side, and he looked up to see Tyrion and Daisy watching them both. "It's the white eyes. Disturbing." He laughed softly and handed the drawing over to the pair. Mother can't really watch any of us walk even now, she always grimaces and puts her hand over her eyes." He scratched grey wind behind the ears, making the direwolf huff with pleasure. "But watching is the only way to see that damn doorway." There was a pause as Tyrion and Daisy looked at the drawing, before looking at each other. Tyrion said eventually. "These runes though, they are in the language of the First Men. And an archaic form at that." "Robb, the crypts are amongst the oldest parts of Winterfell," Daisy said quietly. "And the runes are old as well. And we're not entirely sure what they mean. Plain can, sing. Talk. To plain, singing. Freedom. In the sky birthed." Tyrion said as he looked at the picture. "I know, it makes little sense. I think that the concept behind some of the words has been lost or changed over the years. Plain. A memory stirred for a moment in his mind, something about father's vision when all of this had started, but he thrust that aside. The handprints must mean something though. Yes, but what? Daisy stood in front of the door and ran her hands over it. I feel nothing. Not a thing, not a line, and she froze for an instant as just for a second very faint lines appeared in the stone, as if the doorway had shimmered into partial sight for a heartbeat. What was that? That was the door. Robb breathed as he stood hurriedly. Do that again, Daisy. She ran her hands over the wall again, but this time nothing happened. I don't understand. Wait, said Tyrion, clasping his hands together and rubbing them in a line from his chin to just under his nose. Wait. And then he stepped forwards and ran his hands all over the wall, watching carefully as he did so. Robb, can you please walk into Greywind and then tell us how or something when my hands pass over one of the handprints? Point with a paw or something. He sat back down, placed a hand on Greywind's head and shifted again, suddenly seeing through the eyes of his direwolf. Tyrion's hands were moving in roughly the right direction, and when they finally passed over the right most of the 3 sets of handprints he vuffed with emphasis, which felt strange indeed. Tyrion froze. Robb. My right hand. Or my left? He shifted back and then stood. Left. Tyrion looked at the wall. And we see nothing. Very well. Time to test a theory. Daisy. Put your hand either of them where my left hand is as I remove it. Ready. Go. Daisy put her hand on the wall on the spot they had indicated, and then they all gasped as faint lines started to appear on the wall, going upwards and outwards until the faintest of outlines could be seen of the carvings on the doorway. How did that? Robb breathed and then went still. Wait. The night fort. Tyrion all but crowed. The lock on the crypt's there. When others tested it was intact, but the moment that you touched it, it fell apart. Magic. Magic tied to House Stark. When I touched the handprint there was nothing there, but when Daisy, who is part Stark, touched it, it activated. We have our answer. What if I touch the other set of human handprints on the left? Robb gazed at the wall, assessing roughly where the other carvings were. Daisy, place your other hand about 2 inches from the one on the wall, that should be the right place. And then he strode over and ran his hands slowly over the place where he was sure the other carvings were. The faint lines seemed to shimmer for a moment and then deepen and appear more distinct. They were more visible now and the carvings could be seen more clearly, but they were still tenuous in places. I'm not a full Stark, Daisy whispered in disappointment. Robb, we need your brothers and sisters. Tyrion smirked and then turned his head so that he faced the part of the passage that led to the outside. Bran. There was a confused noise for a moment and then a cautious tousled head hoved into view in the distance. What? The word was said with a combination of suspicion and annoyance that he had been discovered, and judging by the sudden muttering of others in the distance his little brother was not alone. Get your sisters and then come down here. Robb roared. Mayor Stillowin too. There was a further confused noise and then the head vanished. Robb looked at the others and rolled his eyes. The terrible foursome are still convinced that Vermix's eggs are somewhere in Winterfell. And they think that they might be behind the doors here. Tyrion and Daisy both rolled their eyes at this, but then looked back at the lines on the wall. What can this be? Daisy breathed. It was Arya who arrived first, an Arya who had mud on her feet and a smear of either dirt or dust on her cheek, and Robb smothered a smile at what Mother would say on seeing her. Arya underfoot had obviously been exploring again. What's going on? She came to a halt in the passage and looked at the wall with wide eyes. What's that? Magic, the 3 almost chorused, beforeing each other and then laughing a little. Something our ancestors hid, Arya. Robb answered her. Tied to our blood. Arya, can you go over to where Daisy is now and put your hands where hers are now? Why? Arya asked, but she still moved over to Daisy, who showed her where to place her hands. And then as she did so she froze as the lines shimmered again and then deepened. Excited, Arya looked about. This is magic. I said Robb, and then he looked around as Bran arrived with others. Sansa and of course Domeric were amongst the first, then Mother and Mayor Stillowin, and then the curious remainder of the terrible foursome and of course Shireen. All slowed and gaped at the doorway. It's magic that's linked to the Starks, Tyrion explained with an expansive gesture at the door. Daisy's hands gave us the hint when she touched the right place on the wall by accident. Stark blood activates it. Does it open? Edric asked, as eager as any of them. Then he frowned. There are no dragon eggs on the carvings. Edric, mother said gently, I fear that this was closed and unknown when Vermax was here. This is ancient. The young Baratheon frowned in confusion at that, but then looked at the door again. But does it open? Everyone looked at the door and then Tyrion walked forwards and pushed at where the doors joined. But nothing happened. I had to push as there's nowhere to pull, he muttered as he stepped back and then sighed. It's the third handprints, isn't it? It was Domeric who asked the question, or rather stated the obvious, and Robb nodded thoughtfully as he looked at them. 3 fingers and a thumb and small hands at that. He felt as if he had dropped a dragon and found a stag. The hands of the children of the forest. Who are, sadly, anywhere but here, Tyrion mused. There was one north of the wall, but she died as Mance Rayder told us. And there are, based on the Green Man's cryptic comments, some on the Isle of Faces. Which is reassuring, because they were thought to be extinct. Perhaps a raven to house went at Harrenhal or another lordly house close to the Isle. As mother seemed to think this over and then turned to Lewin, there was a sudden interruption. In Owerith Sachaldorf forest. Everyone stared at Bran, who had turned bright red and was shifting from foot to foot uneasily. What was that, sweetling? Mother asked uncertainly. I know where there's a child of the forest. Bran said the words in a less rushed manner. And they all stared at him. You do not. Arya said with a combination of indignation and confusion. I do too. Bran snapped. Robb swapped a glance with Mother, who knelt by his brother's side. Sweetling, are you sure about this? This isn't something you've dreamt. But Bran shook his head vehemently, before drooping slightly as his friends all stared at him with a mix of betrayal and bafflement. I met her more than a week ago. She's called Quicksilver. And she told me that I had to keep her presence a secret. She said that I couldn't tell anyone until the right time. He looked at the doorway. Isn't this the right time? There was a moment of quiet confusion. And this Quicksilver is, where? Mother asked, bemusedly. The Godswood, Mother, Bran said quietly. He looked deeply uneasy. I gave my word to her that I wouldn't tell anyone about her. I had to keep my word. But this is important, isn't it, Robb? He looked at his brother and realized that he was very serious and indeed on the brink of tears. It is, Bran. It's all right, you did the right thing. So, you saw her there? Bran seemed to slump more than a little in relief. Yes. His brow wrinkled in confusion. She said that we're linked somehow. And, she kissed me. On the lips, cheeks and forehead. Like it meant something. Someone, perhaps Daisy, seemed to gasp at that, but he didn't know why. He looked at his brother. Bran, can you take me to this Quicksilver? Bran looked at him solemnly. And then he nodded. Bran. He was both excited and dreading this. Keeping Quicksilver a secret had been the hardest thing he'd ever done in his life. He'd wanted to tell his friends so very badly that there was an actual child of the forest living in the Godswood, but he couldn't. And now he'd had to tell everyone, and he could feel their betrayed looks on his back even as he led Robb to the Godswood, with Summer and Grey Wind flanking them and Mother and Daisy following them. They seemed to be having a strained talk about something. But before they got to the Godswood, Daisy called on them to stop for a moment. He turned and looked at her and also at Mother, who had a peculiar look on her face. What's amiss? Robb asked with a frown. Firstly, we need to warn people not to hurt Quicksilver when she comes with us, Daisy said quietly. This is too important to risk her life. No one has seen a child of the forest here in Winterfell in centuries. People will be surprised. A good point, Robb said slowly. He looked around. Jory, the captain of the guard, who was walking with his uncle in the distance, strode quickly over to them. Lord Robb. Robb glanced at Bran. According to Bran, there's a child of the forest here in the Godswood. Warn the guards and household staff that if they see her, her name is Quicksilver, they are not to harm her in any way. Bran nodded firmly and then realized that the castles were both gaping at Robb with astonishment. As you say, my lord. And with that they strode off, talking and then splitting apart. There is something else, Daisy said quietly. Bran. Those kisses she gave you. What order were they in again? He frowned in puzzlement. And then he pointed at his forehead, his left cheek, his right cheek and then, blushing, his lips. Daisy pulled her skirts up a little and then knelt beside him. We know very little about the children of the forest, she muttered, and there was regret in her voice. But my father gathered as much as he could about them in his research. And we know that they had certain values, certain ties to the world around them. She touched her own forehead. Thought she touched her left cheek, eternity she touched her right cheek, dedication, and then she touched her lips, heart. Bran stared at her. Does that mean something? It means that you two are linked. Firmly linked. She seemed to be amused by something and then she looked at Mother. Your good daughters will be interesting. Mother blinked at this and then she went white. Are you sure? She said the words in a strangled manner that made Bran look at her worriedly. I am. And then Daisy stood again. Cat, sometimes things are the way that fate has written them. I think that this is one of those things. Which was confusing, but before he could ask what she meant she walked off towards the godswood and he scurried to follow and then lead them, Summer again bounding by his side. As they entered the godswood he looked about worriedly even as he took a deep breath of air into his lungs. He did so love this place. The smells of grass under his feet and wood and leaves and water were all things that made him feel connected to the old gods. Where was Quicksilver though? As they walked towards the heart tree he wondered if he should call out to her, and then he stopped dead in his tracks when she stepped out from behind the tree. She was wearing a red jerkin this time and her hair seemed to be braided slightly differently. Robb also stopped and his eyes widened as he saw her. Mother and Daisy also came to a halt. The direwolves, oddly, did not. They strode over to Quicksilver, sniffed at her face and hands for a long moment and then sat down almost at her feet as she smiled at them. And then she looked at him. Hello Bran. He strode up to her, ignoring the odd noise that came from Mother. Hello Quicksilver. I'm sorry, I know I said I'd keep you a secret, but we found this door in the crypts and Robb said we need a child of the forest to open it, and you're not upset, are you? No, I'm not. It is as I had dreamt it. It's time. She looked at Robb and the others. Hello. I am Quicksilver, as Bran has already told you. He looked back at them. Mother was pale as a ghost, Robb looked flabbergasted and Daisy had an odd smile on her face. I greet you with earth and water, air and stone, in the name of the old gods, Daisy said suddenly in the language of the first men. Little sister. Quicksilver smiled and bowed at that. I thank you for your greeting, your welcome and your protection. And then she looked at Robb. So, you are the one. When you came back the trees on the Isle of Faces spoke your name. He frowned in confusion. Came back. Robb had never been away. Much has changed, Robb said slowly. And much forgotten. Your pardon, I never thought I'd ever see a child of the forest. I thought you were all gone. Quicksilver smiled. We were protected on the Isle of Faces. We waited. And now that the call has been sent and the true enemy identified, we can walk the land again. Through the secret places that the green men have tended. We need your help, Bran said. The door. Then we shall open it. She strode up to him, took his hand and led him across the godswood in the direction of the crypts. The direwolves followed them at once and then the others seemed to shake themselves out of their shock and came as well. When they walked out of the godswood he could hear the mutter as people saw Quicksilver, but Jory and his uncle seemed to have spoken to a lot of people and no one seemed too alarmed. He could understand if some had been, but she was not a threat to anyone as she strode next to him, her hand in his. It felt right, her palm on his, and he seemed to sense a pulse from that hand, a strong and steady one that said that she was calm. As they entered the passageway that led to the door he could hear the muttering from Arya ahead of him, protesting at having to wait, and which suddenly stopped when they came into view. Hello, he said as they approached a very wide-eyed Maester Lewin, Arya, Sansa, Edric, Robert, Ned, Domeric and Tyrion. This is Quicksilver. The child of the forest swept them all with her red eyes. I am honored to meet you all. And then she turned to face the doors, which could just still be seen as Arya had one hand on the wall. Arya, please put your other hand on the wall. Robb, please do the same on the other side. Arya did as she was told but then frowned. How did you know my name? I know many things, Quicksilver said as she waited for Robb to move into place. I am glad to know that you have been turned from one fate in a future that will now never be. What? Another time. Now, she placed her hands on the small handprints in the middle of the door, and then Bran gasped as the door glowed brighter and brighter, as if the sun was suddenly shining from it briefly. And then Quicksilver pushed and the door opened with a groan and a scrape of stone on stone, each part of it swinging back into the darkness beyond. There was a chamber in there, in shadow. There was a stunned silence that was broken by Mayor Stillowin. I shall fetch lanterns, my lords and ladies. And then he strode off with a surprising turn of speed for a man who was so old. Bran edged up to the door and glanced into it. It was dark in there. And there was a smell of stuffy air. Bran, please step back, Tyrion said softly. We know that door hasn't been open for some time, the air might be foul. Like under the Godswood at Storm's End? Edric asked. Sir Barristan Selmy warned father against the air there. There was a pause as they waited, and then Edric, Robert and Ned turned to him. Why didn't you tell us about her? Edric said with a flail of his hands in frustration. She told me not to. Why? She was a secret. We can keep a secret. Would you have believed me without seeing her? The other three looked at him as if they were both impressed by his point but also disgusted by it. They would not have, Quicksilver said with a sigh. You humans sometimes can only see as far as what is in front of you. Footsteps heralded the return of Mayor Stillowin and the Castles, both of whom looked at Quicksilver as if they doubted the evidence of their own eyes, and Bran found himself realizing that she had a point. They all bore lanterns in both hands and they were quickly shared about. Right, said Robb with a bit of a quaver in his voice, let's be about this. And then he stepped into the doorway. Bran gulped and then followed him in, with the others joining them. The room was wide, with well-dressed stone on all sides and flagstones that looked, well, less worn than the other parts of the floors of the crypts. Some had runes on them, like a pattern that repeated itself here and there. But there was very little dust. How could that be? And then he saw the throne. It had to be a throne, surely. It was stone, large and impressive, and it sat on the far wall opposite the doorway. And it was carved all over. Robb and Tyrion stopped dead in their tracks as they saw it, and Bran looked at them in confusion. They had almost identical looks of shock on their faces. Robb. What's wrong? It's like the chair at the Night Fort, Robb muttered as he lifted his lantern and stared at it. The throne, if you can call it that only a Stark can sit in, as otherwise it sends them mad. Why would there be another one here? Because they are linked, Quicksilver said solemnly. A Stark who sits in one can talk to a Stark that sits in the other. The wall can talk to Winterfell and Winterfell to the wall. And more than that. Winterfell here. Hence the name. The first king of the others was fed to the heart tree here. There has always been magic here, in the very stones under Winterfell, in the warm water that pulses through it. Bran the Builder built something special that has endured. And those two thrones, they were grown out of the same stone, by a Stonesinger. Stonesingers, Daisy whispered the word, before looking at Tyrion. Wargs are rare. Greenseers are rarer still. But Stonesingers, men and women who can shape stone with their voice and a gesture, they are so rare that few have ever been recorded. Bran the Builder was one, Quicksilver said quietly. It's in the blood of Starks. It has slept for a long time. It's time for it to wake up. And then she looked at him. Jaime. He sighed as he saddled his horse and then cinched the various bits correctly. There had been a time when he would have had a squire or a groom to do this. These days he did it all himself as there was no one else. Not for the Kingslayer. Turning from his horse he caught sight of Adam, who was leaning against a post and looking mulish. I still think that I should go with you. No, Jaime said, with a wry smile. The offer is appreciated though. But you were not invited, and given the nature of the man who did the inviting, that might be important. Adam pulled a face. You don't even know where you're going, just north of the wall. I've always wanted to travel and see something of the world, Jamie quipped, before sobering. Adam, I know you don't follow us. Besides, I need you to do something for me. His oldest friend pulled another face before sighing. Very well. What? Train Joffrey whilst I'm away. This brought him a stare and another sigh. Will he listen to me? He will. I've told him to. A command from his father. You do know that I might have to kick his ass to get him to listen at times, don't you? Kick away. He stared at his feet for a moment. You might kick some sense into him. The boy still harbors dreams of returning to King's Landing. I see it in his eyes at times. Cersei spoiled him too much. And now he's here and only now starting to come to terms with it all. I know. The men have been talking of him. And few like him. Adam strode towards him and held out a hand. Very well. I'll keep an eye on the boy. And kick his ass about the training yard when required. Good, Jamie said as he clasped the hand of his friend. Thank you, Adam. And yes, I'll tell you what this trip north of the wall was all about when we get back. As he led his horse out into the courtyard, he could see that the Green Man was already there, along with the Blackfish and Brian of Tarth, all of whom were talking quietly with the Lord Commander and Maester Aemon. As he approached, they looked at him, nodded, and then the three in green cloaks mounted their horses. As he also mounted his horse, he could see that many others were watching them all in the courtyard in front of the gate, from the king, who was watching from a high balcony with Sir Barristan Selmy and father next to him, to a group of recruits that included a pale-faced Joffrey in front of Sir Alisa Thorne. And then, after a wave of the arm from the Green Man, they were off, trotting slowly across the courtyard and then into the tunnel that led beneath the wall. As they rode, he could hear the echoes of hooves on the stones beneath them, and not for the last time he wondered about the men who had first built this monstrous thing. He shivered as they rode out of the far end of the tunnel and then faced the winds there. A cold north wind was blowing, one that seemed to promise snow and ice, and he thanked Tyrion's meticulous notes about what to wear at the wall and in what order he should wear it. He thought about his little brother for a moment and then smiled. He hoped that he was truly as happy with his wife as his letters had said. Perhaps I should now tell you where we are bound, Sir Jamie. The Green Man's words broke into his reverie. Perhaps you should. Where exactly are we off to? You merely mentioned a wander north of the wall. We head towards the Fist of the First Men and then I think northeast from there. I will have a better idea once we get closer. The ties between north of the wall and south of it are still strengthening, but I should have a good idea of our destination soon. This made no sense, and something must have been seen on his face, because the Green Man laughed softly. I know. Sounds like madness. It's not. We ride to a place that the children of the forest have known for many a year. They are not a people who use maps that we men would understand. More madness. Sir Duncan Green Man, the children of the forest are extinct, or so my brother told me. The three riders in green all laughed at that, and he felt his cheeks flush in anger. What? Your pardon, Sir Jamie, but they are very much alive, said Brian of Tarth with a smile that made her look almost comely. We have seen them on the Isle of Faces. Your brother merely was misinformed. The smile faltered. They were protected on the Isle from those who would have killed them. Speaking of things that would have killed them, the Green Man broke in. Sir Jamie, should at any point on our trip north I tell you to get off your horse at once and hug the nearest tree, you must do so. I must. You must. Because if I do so, it means that another is approaching and that time is of the essence, and that if you don't do exactly as I order then you will die. He said the words in a way that made Jamie look at him suddenly. He was very serious. Very well. He licked his lips, which suddenly seemed to be very dry. And what will we be doing at this place? The Green Man seemed to go somewhere within himself for a long moment before returning. Tell me, Sir Jamie, have you ever heard of Lord Brynden Rivers? He blinked at that. Then he frowned. Tyrion once told me of him. He was a bastard son of Aegon the Unworthy, one of those legitimized by the fat fool. Bloodraven, some called him. He was a hand of two kings, I think, and then sent to the wall by, and then he blanched and eyed the Green Man. Aegon the Unlikely. The old man smiled slightly at the mention of his dearest friend. Quite right, Sir Jamie, very good. Why ask of him? We're off to meet him. He gaped at the green man. But, that's not possible. He'd be as ancient as I am. The green man looked at him with a grin and a gleam in his eye, before sighing and shaking his head a little. I went to the Isles of Faces and learned much there. He did not. From what I sense from the earth, the water and the trees, he extended his life in a different way. And we must talk to him. And then the green man clapped his heels to his horse and led them in a gallop north through the trees. Robb. He sat in father's solar and stared at the wall opposite with a certain sense of almost bewilderment. There was a child of the forest in the godswood of Winterfell, and she seemed to be linked in some fashion to his little brother. In fact, based on what had been said so far, there was an excellent chance that she would be his good sister. Mother had retired to her room and was probably still recovering from the very concept of the possibility that Bran's future wife might not be human. It was a thought that made him sigh and then shake his head a little. To one side Grey Wind huffled in his sleep. In the meantime, there was the reality that was the chair in the room that they had discovered, the chair that made his hackles rise just looking at it. Yes, it was almost exactly like the chair in the night fort, or so he thought. The chair tied specifically to his family, or perhaps it might be better to say his blood. The chair that drove anyone who was not a Stark mad if they sat in it. It was all important, he could tell that. His ancestors wouldn't have built them or placed them or whatever it was that they had done to create them, Bran the Builder perhaps. Was that the secret to all the things that his ancestor had built? Knuckles rapped on the door and he looked up to see Tyrion standing there. Robb. Do you have a moment? He waved a hand and the little man closed the door behind him, walked tiredly in and sat in a chair. You seem to be as bemused as I am, Tyrion sighed. It's been an interesting day. A child of the forest, here in Winterfell. I thought that they were extinct. We truly live in a new age of wonders. An age that our ancestors predicted would come one day, Robb replied somberly. They knew it. They planned for it. And here we are, stumbling in the near dark, wondering what they had planned, through the haze of the ages. The haze of the ages, you're waxing lyrical there, Robb. Tyrion said with a smile. Then he sobered. There's no reference to the chair in any records here in Winterfell, I take it. Not a word. Another secret that a Stark took to the grave. More than likely. The door also requires a child of the forest. We don't even know the last time that one was here. Tyrion nodded, before leaning forwards. Then Daisy and I must go to Shuristone as soon as possible. Not just to ascertain that the library there has been restored after Bootal's thefts, but to see if the old Lord Shuristone had any records of anything that might be related to this. If the Shuristones were indeed the recorders of the history of the North, then there might be records that we need to know about. This made sense and Robb nodded thoughtfully. I agree. When will you go? In a day or so. A flying visit, as fast as we can. Not as fast as our now legendary ride down from the wall, but as fast as we can. I have a few Lannister guardsmen as an escort, but I'd be grateful for a handful of Stark guardsmen too, in recognition of Dace's own Stark blood. We'll send them back of course and return with a few Shuristone guards. Dace has already sent word. Good, Robb said. Agreed. A good idea. A silence fell and then Tyrion looked at him quizzically. I take it that you are awaiting a raven from the wall. This made him smile slightly. Aye. On if Val is an Umber or not, as declared by the king and also Lord Umber. Aye. He sighed and rubbed a hand over his face. Tyrion, he looked at the door to make sure it was closed. In that other time, I did not act with wisdom in my marriage. I married from, well, what I thought was love and the right thing to do after. I say no more, Tyrion said with upraised hands. A different time. A different world. The politics of this time have changed. The North needs the wildlings, the free folk, call them what you may. Your father is right, they can grow the North in ways that few would have thought. Val is key to that. The fact that you love her and she loves you is a wondrous gift to you both. It's both political and personal, and the latter trumps the former in a way. He nodded choppily. Yes. But what if the king says no? Then the king would be a fool, but the king is not of the North and is not a fool. Nor will he say no. I will wager any amount you like that he says yes. He would do anything for the son of Ned Stark. Taking in a long breath, he looked at the ceiling. Then he looked back at Tyrion. I'll have a word with the castles. The guards you take to Sheristone will be good men. Thank you, Robb. Tyrion smiled, got down from the chair and walked out. Robb sat there for a while longer, before shaking his head and standing. Enough. Enough wool gathering. And then he heard the sound of hurried boots in the corridor and looked at the door as Maester Lewin arrived there, puffing more than a bit as he held out a curl of paper that was obviously a Raven message. Lord Robb, from His Grace, the King. From a fast Raven. With a hand that he commanded to stop shaking, he took the message. It was from the King. He read it and all of a sudden he stilled. He looked at Lewin and nodded. Thank you. Where? Outside, the Great Hall. He nodded, clicked his tongue at Grey Wind, who had already woken up and was looking at him, and then strode out, feeling almost dazed. He found Val indeed outside the Great Hall, talking quietly with her mother, grandfather and very pregnant sister. As he approached they all looked at him, and then Val seemed to read something in his face and paled. Robb. I mean, Lord Robb. What's amiss? Nothing's amiss, he said thickly, before looking at the message, swallowing and then clearing his throat. I have a message from His Grace the King, Robert Baratheon, the first of his name. He has conferred with Lord Umber. Given the circumstances of your birth, but also what has happened since, he straightened up and looked her in the eye. You are Val Umber. Your sister is also an Umber. She is also Lady Rhaeda, after the ennoblement of her husband. Dalla and her mother both gasped and then looked at each other, whilst Mors Umber nodded and grunted happily. Val, however, seemed to draw herself up almost regally and then looked at him. Thank you, Lord Robb, Val said after a moment. Lady Val, he replied. All of a sudden he seemed to be unable to speak properly, and then he swallowed and stepped forwards and caught her hands in his own. I would be honored beyond words if you would consider me as a suitor for your hand in marriage. She just looked at him for a long moment. Robb Stark, she said eventually, you are a formal idiot. And I love you for it. You saved my life at least once. Yes. And then she kissed him, hungrily. Ned. He had to admit to feeling a growing sense of unease as the ship he was on beat its way into the great harbour of Old Town as the sun rose in the east. Just looking at the high tower made the unease grow. There was something about the place that made him feel odd. Strange. As if there was something in the huge structure that was looking at him. Whatever he was feeling, Frostfire felt it too. The moment that he had laid eyes on the high tower, she had been there by his side, growling in a low rolling tone that seemed to shake the deck under her feet. He could sense the message she was giving off in an instant: danger. What does she sense? Paxter Redwine looked a worried man, his balding head creased with a frown. Danger, Ned muttered. Just that, danger. And I feel it too. There's something there. The drowned bloody god, Paxter spat bitterly. Gods. Bloody Ironborn. Ned nodded and then looked out at the wharves and docks of Old Town as they passed them. Crowds were growing there, silent and tense. Word had obviously passed of their arrival, and he wondered who was in that crowd. Were there members of the faith militant watching the ship? Ironborn. He was a worshipper of the old gods. Did anyone resent that? What was the word on the street about why he was here? Would anyone want to stop him, because they wanted a septon to try and cleanse the gate? He sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. He just wanted to get this over and done with and then go home, but the more he thought about it, the more he almost despaired of the task ahead of him. He was going to confront a god. A weakened, insane god, but still a god. It was like something out of the Age of Legends, and he was no Bran the Builder or Garth Greenhand. He was just Ned Stark. Frostfire turned to look at him and let out a huffing noise that sounded like admonishment, and he smiled slightly. All right, he was just Ned Stark, Nearwalk with a direwolf that made Groan go pale and tremble when it growled at them. Where to, Ned? Paxter Redwine asked. Lord Tyrell will be at the High Tower, I think. The High Tower, Ned said with a nod. Let's be about this. There are a lot of eyes on us. The direwolf makes it obvious that you're here, Ned Paxter said with a slight smile. Then the smile vanished. The blight is making a lot of people very worried. As it should, Ned sighed. Paxter nodded and then bellowed a string of nautical orders that made the ship heel slightly as it set a course right for the docks by the high tower itself. You need not worry about Willers Tyrell, he's not his father, Paxter said as he looked at Ned again. He's young but he's got a head on his shoulders. That said, his father could have hidden depths at times. Ned nodded. His father always made me wonder if he was a fool or not. The siege of Storm's End, the manner in which it was done, with no men being sent to help Roger at the Trident, well, I wondered. Paxter tilted his head to one side. We all wondered. When word came of various burning people in court for the slightest of reasons and then your victory at the Stony September, Mace Tyrell went very quiet on everyone. There were rumors that orders had come from King's Landing to send men to aid Roger at the Trident, but if they were true or not, I could not say. I did hear the men mutter that he had become Lord Turtle, though he had drawn his head and limbs in and was looking at Storm's End as if it was the only thing in the world. I don't know if he was undecided or just realized that staying before the walls of Storm's End and besieging it was the only thing to do, but, well, I'll tell you this in confidence, Ned. I was at sea, on patrol, the night that the Onion Knight sailed in to deliver his cargo. And when a seaman told me that he'd seen a sail by the shore, slipping in between it and us, I told him that he was seeing things, that it was naught but a shadow. And after we heard that Storm's End had been resupplied, Mace Tyrell didn't say a damn word to me in censure. When your banners were seen after King's Landing fell, I know that he looked as if he'd been reprieved from the gallows. Which was all news to him, but Ned just nodded. A difficult man to understand. Paxter inclined his head and then they both waited as the ship sailed on into the great harbour of Old Town, heading straight towards the vast bulk of the high tower. As they approached the docks there he could see men assembling by the wharf that they were headed for, with banners flying from standards. He could see the white tower with red flames on a grey background of House Hightower and of course the golden rose on a green field of House Tyrell. The ship slowed as the captain bellowed orders under the critical eye of Paxter Redwine, and as it approached the wharf he looked at the party assembled there. Willers Tyrell was obviously the man standing at the head of the group, with a short spear of ancient appearance strapped to his back. Next to him stood Lytton Hightower, and behind them both was a young man who looked as if he'd lost quite a bit of weight but who was still, well, pudgy. Familiar to it could only be Samwell Tully. As the ship was moored he placed a hand on Frostfear's head and looked at her. She was still staring at the high tower itself and still tense and growling. You feel it too, don't you? She looked at him briefly and he could see something in her eyes that made him sense that there was a very real danger there and that something was coming. Danger. Danger comes. Beware. By now the gangplank had been rigged and Ned walked to it, Frostfear behind him and then his guards. He strode down to the jetty briskly, before striding over to the approaching welcome party. Lord Stark, let me be first to welcome you to the Reach, said Willers Tyrell as he stepped forwards and held out a hand. I am Lord Tyrell. Thank you for your welcome, Ned replied as he shook hands with the Lord of the Reach. I have answered your call for help. Willers Tyrell gestured to a servant, who stepped forwards with bread and salt, and Ned nodded and partook of the traditional gesture of hospitality. Let me introduce you my grandfather, Lord Lytton Hightower, and also to Lord Samwell Tully, heir to Hornhill and the man who has done much to decipher the language of the runes on the gate under the high tower. Lytton Hightower had a grip of iron and a look of utter determination on his face. And then he surprised Ned by saying in the language of the first men, Be welcome to the high tower, Lord Stark of Winterfell. There is much to do. Ned blinked at that and then replied in the same language, My thanks, Lord Hightower. The high tower called the North has answered. And then he turned to Samwell Tully. I met your father in the North, Lord Samwell. He was well. Asked me to send his regards. An odd expression crossed the young lord's face, as if he was unsure what to say. My thanks, Lord Stark, he said eventually. And thank you for coming. As Lord of Winterfell you're, well, the first of the first men. And they were here long ago, to build this. He looked at the bulk of the high tower. Bran the Builder. I've met his ghost. He looked at the incredulous looks of those in front of him and then inclined his head. And this is Frostfear, my direwolf. I'd be obliged if word passes that she's not to be harmed in any way. There was a moment of quiet eyeing of the direwolf, but word had obviously passed of her coming and Lord Tyrell nodded sharply. Agreed, Lord Stark. Now perhaps we should move to my grandfather's solar. There's much to talk about there. Normally I would welcome you with a feast, but we need to be about this. What's behind that gate must be stopped. Lead on, Lord Tyrell. We must indeed talk. The walk up to the solar was a long one and Ned found himself a little achy in the legs by the time that he got there, but he was interested to see how easily Lord Tyrell matched his stride. The tales were true, the man's leg was fully healed again and he told the tale with little enough prompting from Ned, his voice shaking a little as he spoke of the brief glimpses he had been shown from the field of fire. Ned had countered it with the tale of what he had seen at Barrowtown and as he spoke he could see Samwell Tarlis' eyes bulge a bit and then scribble notes in a book of foolscrap as he somehow wrote and climbed the stairs at the same time. Lord Hightower had listened to the whole thing with a strange abstracted look to his face that had almost made him look gaunt at times. And when they finally reached the solar he saw at once that there was a woman there, daughter of Lord Hightower by the look of her. She curtsied at the sight of him and then spoke the same greeting as Lord Hightower, in the language of the first men. My daughter Malara, Lord Hightower said quietly. She has been assisting in the consulting of these books on the history of the Hightower. Ned nodded and then noted with dry amusement at the start she gave when she laid eyes on Frostfire. Or, was it surprise or something else? He pulled the Fist of Winter out of his belt loop and placed it on a table to one side as he sat down. The Fist of Winter, Lord Tyrell said as he seated himself and placed the half-spear he had been holding to one side himself. Aye, and this is other bane. A weapon of the first men, like yours. And it helped me to save my father, at least for a while. And then he told the full tale, a tale every bit as unsettling as his own take of Barrowtown must have been to the Reachmen. The tale of the gate, with the face appearing in the stonework of the entrance, was chilling. I know that the thing behind the gate is the drowned god, he said heavily after a long moment. Have there been any further developments? The blight, said Willers Tyrell heavily. It continues to spread. Old Town is a tinderbox, Lord Stark, one more spark will set it alight, such is the state of fear and dread. I take it that there have been no further attempts by the Starry September to cleanse the gate. No, said Lord Tyrell in a voice like iron. And no such help, if it can be called that, would be accepted. The Septons have no idea what the gate is, or how to deal with it. How could they? Some of them deny that the other gods even exist. Ned thought about what had happened over the past months. Oh, they exist, he said dryly. You can be very sure of that. You have heard about what happened at Pike, I take it. Lord Hightower asked in a low voice. Word reached me. Fearful news. And word about Euron Greyjoy's ship. I know not what to say about anything about that. Madness. There was a long and bitter moment of silence. And then Lord Tyrell sighed. Lord Stark, I am afraid that I must ask if you can go to the gate at once. Ned grasped the fist and stood up. Aye, let's be about this. And. But he never finished his words, because all of a sudden he felt a deep and terrible wrench in his chest and head, as if the world was spinning for a long moment. Frostfire stiffened as well and shook her head, and then Lord Hightower staggered as well, and then the entire Hightower seemed to shake and then chime, as if a bell somewhere deep inside it had been rung. It was a warning chime, not a celebration chime. He felt it all the way through him, as if something had rung within himself. Grandfather, what's wrong? Lord Tyrell asked wildly, coming to his feet as well and grabbing other bane. Lord Stark. Something's terribly wrong, Lord Hightower said thickly. The Hightower itself cries out in warning. The chiming came again, and this time Willers Tyrell looked wildly about the room. I felt that. As if it was below me though. The gate, Ned said through gritted teeth. We must get there at once. Father. The word came from Malara, who looked terrified all of a sudden, and Lord Hightower turned to her and smiled a strained and terrible smile, before gesturing at her to stay. They took the stairs down two at a time, with Frostfire bounding grimly next to him. The feeling of terrible unease was still there, rolling through him, and he could feel the Hightower still shivering, as if it was a fearful beast. I think, he panted, that Bran the Builder did indeed build a part of this place. I feel it. You feel the high tower? Samwell Tarly puffed, looking as if he was surprised at being able to keep pace with Ned's long legs. I feel it, Ned admitted, looking at the walls. He knew that something was trying to warn him that something terrible was coming, or was perhaps already here. Was the drowned god suddenly trying to escape? Was it some new devilry by the others? Or was it Euron Greyjoy? As they reached the level of the main hall, he could hear the cries of alarm from the garrison and servants of the High Tower, who could obviously feel that something was going on, and it was only Lord Hightower's roars to keep the way ahead clear that stopped a panic-stricken mob from forming. Down they went again, down yet more endless stairs, and then Ned made himself pause and take smaller strides as the stone steps beneath his feet changed to a black stone of smaller size. He knew then that they were approaching the lower part of the High Tower. There were guards there at the lower hall and the corridor that was there, men who had a look of panic in their eyes. But they were still true to their guard posts and only stood aside as they approached, their eyes on Ned and Frostfyre. He could see relief in those eyes, hope that he could do something, and he prayed to the old gods that he wouldn't let them down. Too much depended on this. As they strode quickly down the corridor to a large set of doors, and the sweaty-faced men that guarded them, Lord Tyrell barked out orders to open them. They rushed to do so, and as they opened, Ned would see a strange and terrible green light in the room that lay on the other side. By the old gods and the new, Lord Tyrell muttered. The gate. As they entered, he could see the gate for the first time. It was just as had been described in the letters, but it was glowing, shining with a green, glowing light that spoke of rot and decay. He could almost see faint green flames coming from the gateposts and the lintel, but there was no heat whatsoever. The flames were sickly and cold. It was like nothing he had ever seen before in his life, and his heart almost stopped in his chest for a moment as he beheld it. This was a danger of an unknown kind, but something that he had to confront. He hefted the fist of winter in one hand and then placed a hand on the neck of Frostfyre, who was at his side, growling in defiance of the dreadful thing in the room. Gods, he said thickly. Where do I start with that? There was no warning whatsoever, just a sudden and terrible stench of stagnant water that had something rotting in it. And then there was a strange sound as a black-cloaked and one-eyed man emerged out of a cloud of stinking black air next to him. You die, the man rasped as a knife flashed through the air, and Ned had just enough time to twist slightly to avoid the worst of the blow, but not enough to avoid it completely, and agony flared at his side as the blade bit deep. You die, Stark. And then a fist met his head and he knew no more. Chapter 54. Chapter text. Samwell. He had to admit that he disliked the gate under the High Tower. There was something about it that just made him want to walk away from the damn thing, the moment he laid eyes on it again. He knew what it was now, he knew what was behind it, but he still hated the fact that the moment he approached it he felt the kind of fear that would make even Father piss himself. Which was something that always made him pause. Bravery, could it only be shown on the battlefield, as Father said? Or were there other ways of measuring it? It was hard to tell these days. At least in these past months he'd been finally free of Father's endless bloody moans about how fat he was, how unmartial, not a warrior, too fond of books. Finding other bane had shut him up. And researching the gate and the language of the children of the forest had gained him the respect of Lords Tyrell and Hightower. So Father could bugger off if he came back from the wall and started to drop unsubtle hints about joining the Night's Watch. All of which was a welcome distraction as they headed down the stairs towards the sodding gate. He could tell that Lord Stark was worried, that Lord Hightower was frantic, and that worryingly enough Lord Tyrell was holding other bane in one hand as they hurtled down the stairs. But then even he could tell that something was horribly, horribly wrong. He could feel something in the air, something in his feet, about the way that the High Tower was reacting. That made no bloody sense whatsoever. How could a building react? But then Bran the Builder was supposed to have built at least part of the High Tower. A Stark had had a hand in it. The same Stark who had built Storm's End and Winterfell and the Wall. Who had probably known that the others would return someday, who had probably used magic regularly. The Starks had to be linked to the High Tower. Lord Stark's reaction, and that of his direwolf, was therefore understandable. It was a natural conclusion that he couldn't say because he was running too hard by now. As they reached the doors to the room with the gate he gasped. Gods, the gate was horribly different and he could see flames. The hammering had at least stopped and he wondered why, as he heard Lord Stark mutter about how he could start with the gate. And then a cloud of black and stinking air seemed to appear to one side of Lord Stark and a black-cloaked man emerged from it, holding a knife. "You die," he snarled. "You die, Stark." And then he stabbed at Lord Stark, who twisted somehow just before the blow fell, but who was still hit by it, along with the punch to the head that the man added. "No!" Lord Tyrell bellowed, and then everything went sideways. As the Lord of the Reach pulled Otherbane free of its holder and hefted it in his hand, the black-clad stranger whirled to face him with a snarl. He had dark hair, a patch over one eye, blue lips for some reason, and there was something odd about his face that made Sam instantly uneasy. And then the man pulled a black blade made of shadow out of nothing and swung it at Lord Tyrell, who countered it with Otherbane, and then there was a flash of bright light and black shadow and Sam found himself flying backwards, hitting the floor on his back with a thud that made his head swim. He shook his head, desperate to stop the room from swimming, to get back on his feet. What in the name of all the gods was going on? He flipped himself over and levered himself up. What he saw made his mouth drop open in horror. The stranger was standing to one side, hunched over and groaning, shaking his head as if to clear it. Lord Tyrell was prone on the floor, also groaning, Otherbane not far from him. Lord Hightower was also on his back not too far from Lord Stark, who seemed to have been flipped over by the flash of whatever the hells that had been. And here was where it all got strange, because his giant direwolf was standing by the prone Lord of the North and her eyes were filled with burning red fire as she growled and snarled at the stranger. And to make everything even worse, the doorway from the room was filled with some kind of black-tinted fire, stopping the horrified guards beyond it from entering, and the gate was shaking again, as something howled on the other side, a howl that made every hair on the back of his neck stand on end in sheer terror. "Filthy, fucking, stinking Hightowers!" the stranger finally screamed as he scrubbed at his forehead for a long moment. "And Starks. Scum and vermin. Tyrells too. And gardeners. Ha! But I made it. I'm in. So much for your wards. So much for your spells. I am your own fucking Greyjoy. And I spit on your wards. Getting through was painful, but I'm here. I'm here." He turned and faced the gate. "I'm here." The gate shuddered again and dust cascaded down from the ceiling. Sam stared at it in horror and then looked around quickly. Lord Stark looked as if he was dying, his chest barely rising and falling. Lord Hightower was trying to pull himself up and Lord Tyrell was also groaning and trying to sit up. It was up to him. Oh gods! Sam stood with a shiver and a shudder and then scrabbled over to grab Otherbane. And then he stood and shambled over, chest heaving, to face the mad Greyjoy as he cackled in front of the gate, waving that unsettling and bizarre sword in the air. It was the hardest thing he'd ever done in his life, and he issued a silent prayer to the old gods who had tossed the drowned god through this bloody thing and asked for their help from this madman. For a long moment Euron Greyjoy didn't seem to even notice him, so caught up was he in his cackling madness, and then he blinked and frowned at him. "You boy. Get out of my way. I have a destiny to fulfill. I will become a god here today." "No, you will not," he said, trying to stop his teeth from chattering with terror. "I am Samwell Bloody Tarly and I'll fight you if I have to. You'll not get past me." This seemed to amuse the Ironborn madman immensely, because he laughed and laughed, and as he did Sam stared at him. There was something strange about the man's face, as if the skin was too loose in places. The one eye he could see was almost bulging in its socket and the cheekbones looked a bit odd. "You," Greyjoy finally said. "You're a Tarly. Randall Tarlis whelp. I heard his ear was fat as butter and a craven. Is it you? There's more meat on you than there should be, surely." The cackling came again and then stopped. "Go away, boy." "No," he hefted Otherbane again and then noted how the lunatic blinked and looked warily at it. "Oh, are you afraid of this?" "Otherbane." "I fear nothing," boy Greyjoy snarled. "And I have won. Stark's dying or dead, Tyrell's over there, you are in my way and I will achieve my destiny. I will kill the drowned god. And I will absorb his power. I will wax and others will wane and I will be a god." The noise from the gate stopped suddenly and Sam knew in his heart that whatever the thing was that remained on the other side of the gate, it was terrified. And then there was a sound like something like a keen, or a wail, or a shriek from Otherbane. It shook in his hands as if it was alive, and Sam blinked as it seemed to glow with red light. Euron Greyjoy seemed to flinch slightly, and then he looked about the room wildly, before staring at Frostfyre as if he had only just noticed her. "You!" He shrieked the word. "How did you know?" "No. No. Stark's dead. I killed him." Frostfyre howled at the Ironborn madman, and Sam would see that the eyes of the Lord of the North were barely open but totally white. "Greyjoy," Sam said thickly as the black-clad took a step towards the prone Lord and the direwolf. "Greyjoy." Euron Greyjoy whirled on him, and he swallowed and clenched Otherbane in both hands. "Fight me." They were words that almost made him want to piss himself. But he meant it. "Fight me." There was a long and singing moment of silence as the mad Ironborn seemed to debate what to do in his head, and then he raised the black shadow sword in his one hand and strode towards Sam. "Fuck," he thought in desperation, "I'm going to bloody die. But I'll die like a Tarly." And he hefted Otherbane and prepared to meet that blow from Euron Greyjoy with all he had, and then everything went sideways again. Something shook the room with a massive thud, something froze him in place, Euron Greyjoy too, the latter trying to look in all directions with his one eyeball. "Thank you, Sam." The speaker was Lord Lytton Hightower. He was upright again, and red and green fire burned in his eyes. "You'll never be forgotten for your bravery. Give me Otherbane now." The Lord of the Hightower gestured, and then Otherbane was ripped out of his hands and flew through the air towards Lord Hightower. As it smacked into his hands, he strode, shakily, towards Ned Stark. Euron Greyjoy groaned and then shook in place as he seemed to try and break free of whatever had been done to him, but it was too late. Sam knew it, as Lord Hightower placed Otherbane gently onto the chest of the Lord of the North. "Old gods!" Lord Hightower shouted, and the room seemed to shrink for a long moment as everyone, including the now crouching Lord Tyrell, whose eyes were widening as he realized what was going on, looked at him. "Old gods!" He looked at the gate and then at the mad Ironborn and then at the direwolf. "A life for a life." And then he placed a hand on the head of Frostfyre. Red light exploded into the room, red light that came from the hand of Lord Hightower, tinged with green. The direwolf froze in place and then howled again. "No." Euron Greyjoy finally bellowed, "No." But it was too late. Ned Stark suddenly sat upright, his face smeared in blood, his hand grasping for and finding the Fist of Winter. And then, as Lord Hightower slumped, bonelessly, down, Lord Stark stood up and hefted the Fist of Winter. Ned. Until his dying day he never understood just what it had been that tugged him, sideways. He remembered a vague feeling of dizziness, of touching Frostfyre's side as he fell, as the darkness took him, and then, it was as if he had jumped sideways. Perspective flickered, he was suddenly a slightly different height and he had too many legs. But he couldn't move. It was as if he knew that he shouldn't move as well. He had to be by himself. He could sense that he was dying, or rather his body was getting weaker and weaker. What had the man who had attacked him had on that blade? It was then that he caught sight of the man, and he suddenly really couldn't move, because there was something else there, inside that man. He could sense it, smell it, see it. There was a blackness about him, like an aura or a shadow. Evil. He was seeing a man who was drenched with evil. And then the man identified himself as Euron Greyjoy, in a cackling rant that made his fur raise with fury and horror. This was the Kinslayer Greyjoy, the man who had murdered his own crew to create something beyond horror. The gate was making horrible noises, some too high-pitched to almost hear. There was something on the other side of it that was terrified, and then he watched as Samwell Tarly confronted Greyjoy. He could tell that the lad was terrified, he could see it in his face, but he still did it anyway. He stood in front of the gate, Otherbane in hand, and he stopped the man in his tracks. Because Ned could tell that he was afraid of Otherbane. And then something ran through him, the knowledge, no, the absolute certainty, that the old gods were here, in this room, at this time. He could feel it. The room seemed to shake, and then he felt something else wax in the room. Someone was performing magic, an old and deep magic that came from the heart. It was Lytton Hightower. He could feel it in the air, and he wondered at how he could do so, if this was how Frostfyre could normally see the world, sense the magic, be aware of such threats. He could sense the moment that Euron Greyjoy seemed to notice him again, that unsettling eye looked at him as the Ironborn Kinslayer ranted at him, and then Otherbane was almost ripped out of young Sam's hands and flew towards Lord Hightower, who took it and then placed it onto the chest of the body to one side that was his real body. Was he dead? Old gods! Hightower cried, and Ned felt his body, both bodies, quiver. Old gods! A life for a life. Red fire exploded everywhere, and as Lytton Hightower placed a hand on his head, he felt himself suddenly fall through a sudden and unimaginable distance. Suddenly there was a need to breath, to take a gulp of air into his lungs, and he sat up, Otherbane clattering on the floor to one side as he clenched his hand around the fist of winter. Strength suddenly flowed through him, the pain at his side receding and then vanishing completely. He stood and flexed his muscles and glared at Greyjoy. His mouth was dry, he could feel dried blood on his forehead, and he was angry. Very fucking angry. And by the way that Greyjoy paled even further, he could tell that the bastard was afraid. "Euron Greyjoy," he said, through a dry mouth. "It's past time for you to die." Samwell Tarly had run to Lord Hightower's body and was shaking his head over it, and Greyjoy stepped back, before casting a quick look at the gate behind him. Frostfire was growling ferociously at him, and at a gesture from Ned started to pace off to one side, flanking him. The Ironborn bared his teeth as he hefted the black and cursed blade in his hand, and then he squinted and pulled a face as he pulled another one out of the air into his free hand. "I think not," Stark Greyjoy growled through lips that seemed wrong somehow. "I have a destiny to fulfill. I will be a god." "No, you're destined to die and become a corpse," Ned replied, and then quickly bent down and picked up Otherbane's his own free hand. He could feel the weapon warm slightly to his touch, and then, to his surprise, the head of the spear lightened and then erupted into red flame that let off no heat. Winterfell. He lunged with the fist, and Greyjoy parried the blow with a grimace, dark sparks sparking off the black blade, before ducking under Ned's second lunge with Otherbane and then making Frostfire dart back just before she could hamstring him. "Damn you!" Greyjoy howled, taking another glance back at the gate. His face looked wrong, the skin slack again, there was something dark under his one eye. "Ned." The word came from Willers Tyrell, who was at last upright and off to one side, looking angry and pugilistic. "Throw me Otherbane." Ned smiled a savage grin and then tossed the weapon to the younger man, who hefted it with a smile as his face was lit up with the red flames from the tip of the spear. "Grandfather died to stop you, you son of a whore, Euron Greyjoy. And we will end you." Greyjoy licked what seemed to be very slack and dry lips with a grey-purple tongue that again looked wrong, and then Ned swung the fist. Greyjoy parried in a shower of black sparks. The other black sword came around but then met Otherbane as Willers Tyrell attacked on the other side. More black sparks, and something in the room seemed to squeal and gibber as Greyjoy danced backwards, his chest heaving from the effort of the fight. Ned took a step forwards. He was tired, but this was a fight for his life and the lives of so many others, and he lashed forwards again, joined by Willers in another dual attack that had Greyjoy again pushed back, black sparks showering onto the floor from the parries that he was delivering with those black blades made of something evil. And then he attacked, slashing against the pair of them, forcing to step backwards themselves as they parried his assault. More black sparks, what were his blades made of? But he had pushed too far. Frostfire went in low as he passed her, those great jaws flashing out, and then suddenly Greyjoy screamed as the direwolf ripped out a part of the pack of his leg. She darted back quickly, shaking her head and spitting out what she had savaged from him, and Ned could see that the flesh she was almost retching on was red and black. Greyjoy went down on one knee for a moment and then staggered upwards, before the fist hammered into his shoulder and something crunched, making him scream again. As he staggered back, almost hopping on his good leg, his lips peeled back and his teeth seemed pointed almost as he snarled at them all. And then he dropped to one knee and thrust the swords into the floor in front of him. Ned blinked, and then a crack of lightning seemed to boom from the swords and something seemed to flash from them. Ned didn't even hesitate. He darted forwards and somehow parried the flash with the fist, directing it away from them and somehow into the far wall, which was scorched from the blow. The impact almost drove Ned to his knees, but then he came fully upright again. "You die now, Greyjoy." The Ironborn bared his teeth again, looked at the approaching Willers Tyrell, glanced at the snarling Frostfire, shot another desperate look at the gate, and then he screamed in pain and frustration. "I will kill you all." And then he raised a hand and conjured a portal of black and stinking air, before passing into it slowly. Ned started forwards, meaning to kill the wretched man, but then the room shook again and Greyjoy screamed again in agony. His face was distorted as he passed into the portal, horribly so, and Ned paled as he saw it ripple in a way that nothing human ever should. Wards. But I am stronger. Another scream rent the air and suddenly he was gone, leaving his robes, which slithered wetly to the ground with an unpleasant noise. Ned stood there panting for a long moment and then he looked at Willers Tyrell, who looked as exhausted as he felt. The black fire at the door to the high tower was gone and the guards who had been on the other side took hesitant steps into the chamber, their eyes wide as they looked at him and the others. "Be careful," Ned panted as he looked about warily. He came from nowhere, although I think that getting here hurt him. Getting out too, Willers said. Left his robes. Not just robes, Santali said, and there was horror in his voice. That's his skin. Ned frowned and then walked over to it. And then he paled. Yes. Euron Greyjoy's skin was puddled on the flagstones, turning grey and then blackening as it seemed to sizzle in the air. He must be dead, Willers muttered as young Tarly threw up to one side. Who could survive that? Someone no longer human, Ned replied. He's beyond wrong. Evil. Mad. And then the gate shook again and then flared with a terrible, unnatural light as it pulsed. The drowned god was coming through. Garland. The screams from the direction of the harbour and the high tower told him that something was horribly wrong, but it wasn't until he looked up and saw that the fire at the spire of the building was burning red-green that he realized what the screams were about. And he felt something, a feeling that something somewhere was very wrong, as if he could feel the tower itself screaming. And then he clapped his heels to the sides of his horse and urged her into a gallop as he called out to his men to join him, which they did after various shocked and muttered oaths. As they thundered down the hill to the harbour he could see more riders and then he recognized Uncle Baylor and his own men in the colours of House Hightower. "Uncle," he shouted. "What's amiss with the High Tower?" His uncle shot a strange look in his direction. "Do you feel it?" "Feel what?" he asked, confused. Uncle Baylor bared his teeth as they galloped down towards the harbour, horseshoes striking sparks off the cobblestones as they went. "The high tower itself," Keen's his uncle told him in a rough aside. "Do you feel it?" This sounded like madness, but then, after a long moment, he blinked. "How can the high tower, Keen?" "The wards," his uncle barked. "The wards. Father told me about them, but I scarce believed him." He bared his teeth. "I do now." By the time they got to the harbour he could see Loras standing at the quay by a large skiff with a group of rowers in the colours of House Hightower, all looking at the tower in horror. "Garland," his brother cried out as he turned at the sound and sight of the horsemen approaching. "The high tower. Look." "I know," Garland ground out, before pointing at the skiff. "Men. To the high tower. At once." The men looked doubtful for a moment, but then Uncle Baylor strode up and looked at them in a way that Garland vowed that he would use himself one day, if he could get that glare right. They manned the skiff at once, tumbling into the seats and grabbing the oars as Garland, Baylor and Loras jumped into the back of the boat, and once it was cast off they put their backs into it and stretched out for the docks of the high tower, with the helmsman barking out the timing of the stroke. They made good time, fueled by fear and urgency, and as they rowed Garland looked up at the high tower and marveled at the color of the flame at its peak. What in the name of all the gods was going on? As they reached the wharf and threw a rope to a servant in the colours of the high tower, Garland sprang out first as soon as he could, followed by Loras and Baylor. Across the stone flagstones they ran, towards the base of the high tower, and as they did he could see Grandfather's steward standing at the main doors, looking uncharacteristically alarmed. "Sirs. Women, what in the name of all the hells is going on?" "Lords Hightower, Stark and Tyrell have all gone down to the gate, sirs." Lord Hightower said that he could feel that the wards had been breached, that something was terribly wrong at the gate. Garland felt the blood drain from his own face, and given the one look on that of his uncle's, he knew that he felt the same fear that he did. To the gate. They ran again, in a rush that was fueled by terror. The high tower itself felt wrong, as if the stones were screaming, and as they hurtled down the stairs he barely remembered to start taking smaller steps once the stone became black and the stairs changed. Someone behind him cursed as he slipped but caught himself on the wall and then plunged downwards. When they reached the doors to the room that housed the gate, they found a mob of men in the colors of various houses, Hightower, Tyrell and Stark predominantly, milling about the doors, which looked wrong. Black but also almost transparent. Wait, were those flames? The doorway was blocked with black flames, or something that looked like them. Make way! Garland roared, and the crowd parted for them, until they reached the strange new doors. Sir Hugh Beesbury was standing before a slumped figure at the base of the doors, uncertainty and terror written on his face. Sir Hugh, what is happening? Why are those doors not open, and what ails that man? Sir Hugh stepped to one side, and Garland looked at the figure, and he took a step back in horror. The figure was that of a slumped man in Hightower colors, or rather someone who had once been a man and who was now a decaying body that was rotting to pieces before their very eyes. Young Roderick touched the flame gate, Sir Garland Beesbury said with terror in his voice. It did that to him. What happened? Garland asked after a moment of horrible incomprehension. The lords went into the room to attend to the gate, Sir Garland, and then, well, I was approaching the doorway when I saw a man appear out of a swirl of darkness within the room. I swear that's what I saw, sirs, I will swear it on anything you like. One moment he was not there and the next he was. He stabbed Lord Stark and then he did something and the doorway was blocked with these fell black flames and... Can anyone see into the room? Uncle Baylor barked, what in the name of the seven hells is happening in there? Beesbury winced. I think that Lord Hightower did something, because Lord Stark and Lord Tyrell are fighting the man in black with that direwolf of Lord Stark, and we all heard voices, sirs, a cry to the old gods that came through the flames, and... The black flames suddenly faltered as they heard another voice boom from the room, I will kill you all. And then there was a scream of agony, and as it ended the black flames were snuffed out. They stared at the doorway, and then Garland, greatly daring, strode hesitantly through the entrance and into a scene of madness. Lord Stark, blood-stained and grim, was standing there next to his direwolf, holding what could only be the fist of winter. Willers was next to him, also bearing the signs of battle and blood, and both were staring at the gate. Samwell Tarly was standing there as well, looking at something black at his feet, and then there was Grandfather, who was lying there on the ground. As others also entered the room through the doorway, Garland ran to his grandfather, Baylor and Laura's at his side, but as they reached Grandfather he could tell at a glance that he was dead. The Lord of the Hightower lay there, chest unmoving, eyes closed, his face set in an expression of concentration. No, he cried out. Grandfather! But then he heard the sound of voices to one side as Lord Stark and Willers spoke with each other, and then he felt the room shake and then be filled with a terrible light. He turned his head to see that the gate was glowing in a terrible way, with a light that was sickly and unnatural. The drowned god is coming through! Lord Stark cried in a great voice. Get out, now, all of you! But he could not move, he was fixed in place with both terror and determination, and none of the others in the room seemed to be able to leave either. Willers bared his teeth at the gate whilst he hefted other bane. Sam Tarly looked as determined as he had ever seen him. Uncle Baylor stood up from his father's corpse, tears running down his face as he drew his sword, and Laura's joined him. The gate flared with light, dimmed and then flared again, like a heartbeat, and then the stone inside it seemed to vanish to reveal a black void of nothingness. Wait, there were hands there, at the base of the far side of the gate, huge and gnarled, bony and white, the white of a dead thing that had been left under water. And then those fingers seemed to flex, and then an arm appeared, withered and thin, but powerful enough to get a better purchase on the gate, and then a face appeared out of the darkness. Lank white hair framed a thin, skeletal face, a face from his darkest nightmares. Sunken eyes over a nose like the fin of a shark, a thin-lipped mouth and a chin that seemed to have withered tentacles that writhed weakly. Then shoulders covered with what looked like a rotten material, and then the whole horrible thing heaved and threw itself through the gate, landing on its skeletal knees as it shook its head and clawed at the flagstones. He stared at it in horror. The drowned god was there, a creature of horror and terror. Its fingers tensed and shattered a flagstone or three as it seemed to hunch there, unable to stand, and then it looked up. There was a madness in its eyes, he could tell that at a glance, madness and more than that. Madness and desperation and something else, perhaps the knowledge that it was dying. And then it opened its mouth and let out a moan that made him flinch, a sound of emptiness and despairing agony, and oh so loud. It was Lord Stark who answered it. Go back to the shadow you came from, he snarled. Go back to the abyss that was made for you. The land of the living is denied to you. Go, back to the grave that was prepared for you. You shall not pass. The great chamber fell silent, and then the drowned god looked at Lord Stark, its face rippling with many emotions, anger and desperation and, yes, fear. And then, in that midst of tumbling changing expressions, a look of hunger. The drowned god lifted itself onto one hand, and then its arm shot out at a surprising speed and grabbed a trembling guard in the colors of the high tower and pulled him back to its face. The wailing man had just enough time to scream, and then the tentacles grabbed his head and guided it straight into the gaping maw with its rotted and black teeth, which crunched down. The man's body flailed for an instant and then went limp. There was a moment of utter horror in the room, and then Ned Stark raised his voice again. "Get out of here, you fools! Now! Out!" Willers roared. "This is between Lord Stark and the drowned god, now! Out!" They ran. Garland knew in that instant that it was the right thing to do, that they didn't stand a chance against the thing that was now in the base of the high tower, chewing on the body of a man that it had so casually killed right in front of them all. And as they ran, he heard the drowned god groan something in a hollow, dry voice, something that he couldn't understand. Someone did understand though. Samwell Tarly went white as a sheet and almost stumbled over his feet. "Oh gods," he choked, "he's hungry and we're prey." They reached the doorway and passed through it, and as they did there was another groaning howl of noise from the drowned god. He looked back, and to his terror he could see the thing by the gate starting to reach for them again, its arm snaking out with a horrible speed that made his mouth go dry. Gods, was it reaching for him? But then there was a howl from the direwolf and a hoarse cry from Lord Stark, and the arm of the drowned god was struck with a blow from the fist of winter and a bite from the direwolf that made it recoil with a snarl. Garland looked at the pair and then gasped. There was red fire in the eyes of the pair from the north, and they seemed to be taller or larger than had been before. The drowned god gaped at them for a long moment, and then it scrunched up its face in hatred and screamed something then, at a volume that made him clutch at his ears to protect them. "The old gods!" Samwell Tarly gasped. "The old gods are in the room. He sees them in Lord Stark and Frostfire. And he hates them for what they did to him, throwing him through the gate. And we can't help." Willers ground out in anguish as he hefted other bane in his hands. "Grandfather died to defeat Euron Greyjoy, but I don't know a fraction of what he knew, so I can't help Ned now. Gods, what have we forgotten?" The drowned god snarled at Lord Stark again and then reached for the doorway again, slower than before, and once again the fist of winter smashed into it, and then Garland gasped as the arm of the drowned god clearly broke, black and bone piercing the white skin with a spray of blood that seemed almost red-blue. The drowned god howled in pain, a noise that shook them all and made dust descend from the ceiling like a fine white mist. "Go back to the shadow," Lord Stark boomed. "Into the abyss of death." He was taller than before, with red fire now playing on the head of the fist, and Frostfire was as big as he was. The drowned god snarled at him, and then the other arm swept out, broken nails at the tip of the hand as it clawed at Ned Stark. The hand never reached its target. Lord Stark twisted to one side, and again the fist of winter whirred through the air as it struck the grasping limb. There was another crack as at least one finger broke, and again the drowned god screamed in pain and anger, a noise that drove all in the passageway to their knees as they covered their ears. Frostfire howled again, a noise that made the ring in his ears cease at once, and then she darted forwards and snapped at the hand as it was withdrawn. There was a snap and a crack, and then the direwolf was retreating, worrying at something and then spitting it out. A whole finger, black bone encased in what looked like rotting white flesh. The drowned god screamed again, forcing yet more dust to rain down from the ceiling, and then it forced itself up on two trembling legs, one ruined arm held close to its body and the other trembling in the air as it looked down at Lord Stark and Frostfire. Its head brushed the ceiling, and there was a look of such utter rage and hatred on its face that made Garland and the others flinch backwards from the doorway. All but Willers, who bared his teeth at the horrible spectre in the room as he held other bane in both hands. But Ned Stark looked unimpressed. He hefted the fist of winter in both hands. There was red fire all around him now, the direwolf too, but he was untouched by it, and he realized that Samwell Tarly was right, that the old gods were protecting them both and by extension them too in the doorway. There was another scream of defiance from the drowned god, and then it strode forwards, its arms reaching for Lord Stark with a terrible intent, desperation written on the face of the god. The fist smashed into one of the hands and then the other as the jaws of the direwolf added their own slashing attacks, and again fingers were severed and what looked like itch flowed. Some of it spattered against Ned Stark's face and he flinched for a moment as it steamed and bubbled, and then he struck again. The fist hammered down again against the elbow of the drowned god, and once again bone splintered and cracked. The drowned god recoiled with a roar of agony, and then Ned Stark struck again. He leapt forwards and the fist was raised over his head, and then with a great blow smashed into the right knee of the drowned god. The impact was a crunching one that obviously broke bone and snapped tendon, and then the drowned god fell, descending onto its broken knee with a scream of pain, before rolling onto its side. As one arm flailed around, Ned Stark struck again, this time hitting its wrist and pulverizing various bones. There was a long and shuddering moment as the drowned god seemed to hunch in within itself, drawing brown limbs up to its body, keening in pain and panic, its eyes clenched closed. And then it opened its eyes and looked at Ned Stark with a glance of such utter hatred that Garland was amazed that the man didn't vanish in a puff of smoke. From the way that the red fire around the Lord of the North and his direwolf seemed to pulse, Garland realized later that the old gods had protected them both from whatever curse the drowned god had directed at them. "You die now." Ned Stark said the words with almost sadness, and then he strode forwards with deadly intent written on his face. The drowned god raised a shaking, shattered hand to fend him off, but it was battered to one side with almost contemptuous ease with the fist. And then the fist came up swiftly and then hammered down against the right temple of the sprawling god. There was a horrible crack and black light poured out from the dreadful wound as the drowned god slumped to one side and then keened in agony. Its arms flailed again, to be met with blows from the fist and snaps of the jaw from the direwolf, and then the fist struck again in the same place on its head. The black light seemed to intensify, and then a wind seemed to start to blow from nowhere through the chamber, blowing towards the gate. The drowned god screamed something unintelligible, its head tilting at an almost impossible angle as the light seemed to dwindle and die in its eyes. The fist came up and then down again and again, crunching into the head of the dying creature that was now huddled before the gate. One more time it went up and descended down to hammer into the head of the drowned god, which shuddered and then went still. And then, as Ned Stark stood there panting next to his direwolf, the wind became a gale, blowing into the gate. It did not touch grandfather's corpse, or anything else but the body of the drowned god, which seemed to be sinking into itself as it almost appeared to be rotting to pieces. The wind intensified and then the body was hurled into the gate, getting briefly caught as one leg hooked around it, before the whole thing was sucked into it. Garland caught sight of a howling void on the other side of the portal before it closed and became nothing more than stone. As he stared, stunned, into the room, the red fire surrounding Ned Stark and his direwolf diminished as they seemed to shrink back to normal size. And then the Lord of the North grinned at his companion and then sank to his knees with weariness. "Gods, I need some ale," panted the Lord of the North. He deserved it. Chapter 55, Chapter 55. Chapter text. Theon. As he knelt before the heart tree he squinted at it. It was not his imagination, it had grown a little overnight. The stoner brows and the green man had been tending to it, the tree that had reconnected with such ancient roots literally beneath his feet. As he prayed to the old gods he thought, once again, what his idiot father would have said if he had seen him doing this. What his brothers Roderick and Maron would have said. And how much he didn't give a damn what they would have thought. This was the right thing to do. No obeisance to a mad creature on the Isle of Bones he had seen in his dreams, or the insane god that he knew was clinging to the gate at the base of the high tower. Just him before a heart tree, praying to the old gods, hoping that he would see Roz again soon and ask her to be his wife. He'd seen too much death and madness over the past days. Far too much. He had a keep to build, a northern house to found, a family to make. And an enemy to kill. The others had to be beaten. Had to be. He heard footsteps to one side and then looked over to see John and Ygritte approaching. They were hand in hand and he smiled slightly. They were obviously devoted to each other and he'd be unsurprised if she wasn't on the way to being pregnant already. Noisy pair. Before you ask, yes, I think it's grown again. Just a bit. But it grows every day. The roots, I think. They looked at him and then at the tree and then nodded at the words, before kneeling to pray. He bowed his head and then blinked in shock as he felt the weirwood pendant quiver on his chest, gently at first and then more violently. What in the name of? He was interrupted by the sensation of something somewhere shaking the ground, or a sensation that felt like that, because not a leaf moved on the heart tree, or anything else around. And then the pendant floated in their air, moving up from his chest, glowing with a faint red light. John and Ygritte were both staring at him, or rather at the pendant, in shock, and then the heart tree seemed to glow as well, red light with a hint of green. Someone, somewhere was screaming in the far distance, and Theon had a sudden feeling that something was under attack far away, as for a moment he seemed to feel a great weight on his mind. For a moment there was a foul smell under his nose, as if he was near something that had died. He reeled for a moment, remembering that island of bones from his dream and that mad thing that had chased him, and then he realized that John and Ygritte were at his side holding him up. "Theon," John said urgently, "what's wrong? Your pendant and the tree. What's happening? And who's that mad screaming bastard?" Ygritte asked. The pendant jerked wildly at the end of its tether for a moment, and then Theon suddenly felt a shock that battered against him for an instant, as if something had flailed against his mind for an instant, but been repelled by something. And then he knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that the drowned god was dead, utterly dead, in fact, gone from this world. "The drowned god has been defeated," he gasped out after a long moment. "He's dead. I felt it. Gods, why? Why should I feel it?" "Where?" Greyjoy said, a shaking voice to one side, and he looked over to see Asher standing there, white-faced, barely upright, and next to a worried Uncle Roderick. "We're tied to him, I think. We rule the Ironborn. It's belief. I felt it too, Theon. The drowned god is dead. I don't know what father would have felt, if he was still alive. Damn fair too. Lady Greyjoy." The call came from a Stonebrow, who was running towards them. The screaming, he shook his head, panting. "It's from a drowned man. He says he can't hear him anymore. The drowned god, I mean. And he's mad. The drowned man, that is. Keeps screaming about how empty his head is now." Theon exchanged a baffled glance with them all. "Gods, what will this do to the Iron Islands? Every drowned man will go mad." It was Ygritte who said the words, looking horrified. "If they are the ones who heard that mad thing, won't they all go mad?" Asher went somehow even paler. "We have to get back to Pike." But it was John who said something far more important. "Oh God's father! Is he all right? Jaime?" The land beyond the wall was like nothing that he had ever known, or had ever suspected could exist. The cold that he had known at the wall seemed to increase a fraction with every mile that they rode north from the wall. And there was something else that increased as well. Unease. The further they rode north, the more he felt as if there was something terrible ahead, that there was danger before them. He was used to chatter, or at least some measure of banter, around him as he rode. Not on this trip. They rode in silence, apart from the occasional muttered words from the Green Man, or the Blackfish, or Brian of Tarth. There was something about the last two that puzzled him greatly. They were not bedding each other, there was no privacy for that, and not really the warmth. They had somehow found a deeply wooded dell for their first night, at the middle of which had been a depression where they had built a good fire. And the Green Man had done something, he knew it. The old man had gone to sleep without a care in the world, leaving the Blackfish to take the first watch. Jaime had taken the second, rousing quickly when the older man had shaken his shoulder, and then noting how the horses were all asleep as well. It was almost warm in that dell that night, not the bone-chilling cold that he was now getting used to, and yet the snow to one side was still there. For so much of his life he'd wondered what had happened to Sir Duncan the Tall, the man whose life had been a legend from beginning to what he had thought was its end. And now here he was, alive, and even more mysterious because of his ties to the old gods, who had extended his life. The second day his unease had deepened further when they had sighted an abandoned wilderling encampment. There had been a barrier of trees all around it, and he could see through the snow the char marks from where they had ignited it to fend off the others and their whites. Some of the latter were still visible, like hummocks in the snow, with the odd charred limb jutting out. He wasn't sure, but perhaps some of those hummocks were quivering slightly, something that made him want to shiver until his bones snapped. There. It was the first word he'd heard in an hour or so as they rode north, and he looked to see the Green Man pointing at a small rise and an outcrop of rocks. "We'll shelter there." He frowned, puzzled. "Shelter from what, sir, Green Man?" The old man shook his head as if he was amused or exasperated. "There is a storm coming, lad. Can you not smell it in the air? He sniffed the air and then realized that the Blackfish and Brian were eyeing each other as if both amused and, something else, something he could not put words to. And then, suddenly, the other three pulled on the reins of their horses and halted them as their eyes widened. Jamie followed suit, a hand going to the hilt of his sword as he looked about. "What's wrong? Danger?" The green man turned and looked south for a long moment, before shaking his head. "Gods," he said after a long moment. "Something has happened to the south of us." A stink rose from the air. Brian of Tarth sounded as if she was struggling for words. There was foulness and then it was gone. What was that? The green man took a deep breath of air into his lungs. "The drowned god is dead," he said eventually. "A god has died. Even though a mad one, the old gods will mourn him. Ned Stark has succeeded. I hope he survived the battle." He eyed the horizon and for the first time Jamie could see the black line of clouds coming from the north. "Ride for the ridge. Now. There's a cave there to shelter in." And so they rode. Caitlin. She sat at her desk and stared down at the parchment in front of her. The empty parchment. The empty parchment that was supposed to be the letter to father. She sighed yet again and ran her hand over her bulging midriff. The baby wasn't helping. He or she was active today. "Cat." She looked up to see Daisy standing there in the doorway, looking a bit worried. "Are you all right, Cat?" She smiled slightly. "Daisy, I'm trying to write a letter to my father about Robb's wedding." Her cousin by marriage frowned slightly and then closed the door behind her and strode over to the nearest chair to the desk, where she seated herself. Indeed. Val's parentage, or part of that at least." "Yes." She paused and then took a deep breath. "My father is, well, he's always been concerned, shall we say, about the importance of marriage and family. House Tully is not as, well established as other houses like House Stark. That's why father insisted on my marriage to Ned after Brandon's death. Although we Tullys go back further than the conquest and the burning of Harrenhal, father has always been keen to foster marriage alliances and deepen our control over the Riverlands." Daisy nodded. "And now Robb is marrying Val. Who is half of House Umber but also half of," she paused, visibly searching for the right words. "Half Wilderling, or free folk as they call themselves," Cat pointed out. "Hardly illustrious, at least in the eyes of father. So, I must write to him and stress the importance of the marriage and House Umber." Another nod greeted this. "On the matter of Robb's wedding, will Lord Tully be, attending?" Cat sighed. "Robb and Val wish for a quick wedding, but with Ned still in the south, we will have to wait for him, I think." She felt her voice wobble for a moment. There was still no word from Ned or anyone at Old Town, and whilst she knew that her Ned was brave and strong and had the fist of winter, she also knew that when Ned had gone south in Robb's memories he had been betrayed and had died. "Starks do not prosper south of the neck," was the saying, and whilst she did not want to believe that it was true, she feared that it was. Daisy looked at her and then sighed herself. "Tyrion and I can put off our trip to Surestone for as long as you like, Cat." "We." She cut her good cousin off with a strained smile. "Daisy, no. You need to go home and set matters right there. Yes, Bootle's loot has been returned to Surestone, but you need to make sure that all is well there. Surestone is your home, Daisy. You need to return there and set everything in order. Your father's books alone would make it worth the visit." "Thank you, Cat," Daisy said, looking strained. But with no news yet of Ned and his battle with the drowned god, and this talk of someone trying to kill a Stark, perhaps Ned. She closed her eyes for a long and strained moment and then she heard the sound of hesitant knuckles on the door, which then creaked open to reveal a worried-looking Bran. "Mother." "What is it, Bran?" she asked with a warm smile that was a bit forced. Her son seemed to sense that she was worried, but stepped into the room and then turned to reveal Quicksilver, who was dressed in a black garment and looked very solemn. After a moment the child of the forest bowed formally and then took a measured step forward. "Lady Stark, I bring word from Old Town." She stood abruptly, her hands going instinctively to her swollen stomach. "You have word of Ned?" "How?" Quicksilver smiled thinly. "The old gods speak freely to our people." The smile vanished. "The drowned god is dead." The Stark, Ned Stark as you know him, killed him. She felt light-headed for an instant and then girded herself. Is Ned? I mean, did he? The Stark lives, fear not. Quicksilver smiled again. Kat suppressed the need to burst into tears with relief, and instead inspected the bottom of her skirt as some inconvenient tears fell from her eyes. Ned is all right. She eventually choked the words out. Quicksilver's eyes flickered a little. He has killed a god. The old gods helped him, but he has been marked. He will bear a scar. And what that scar will mean I cannot say because I do not know. But I will say this, he bears the favor of the old gods. And he will return to Winterfell. And then Kat wept. Ned. When he woke up he lay there for a long moment, staring at the ceiling in some puzzlement. This was not a familiar ceiling. And then the memories crashed home, almost like bludgeons. The fights before the gate. Him, dying. Had he really been dead in that first battle, seeing things from the eyes of Frostfyre, before Lytton Hightower had sacrificed his life for that his? And then the fight against the drowned god. Who he had almost felt sorry for at times. Which was a peculiar thing. The creature had been trying to kill him. Whence had the sorrow come from? Had the old gods influenced him? Had it been their sorrowful but determined support that had helped him to survive that fight? He'd felt something around him and in him as he and Frostfyre had battled the huge but pitiable creature. And they'd won. He closed his eyes for a long moment as he luxuriated in the feeling of being in clean sheets. He had dreamt hard when he had been asleep, he knew that, but remembering the dreams was like trying to hold smoke in his hands. He remembered one dream being in the arms of his mother, whilst father held them both. But their eyes had been filled with red fire tinged with green. He remembered feeling utterly safe as he was held. What had that been? Just a dream, or something else? Feeling the touch of the sheets on his body he lifted them. Ah! He was naked. He had a vague memory of quaffing a few mugs of ale whilst a maester examined himself, and Willers Tyrell remembered devouring a honeycake and then dunking himself in a bath, and then, nothing. Just sleep. He swung himself mostly out of bed and then groaned as a large number of aches and pains made their presence known. Gods, but he ached in places he'd barely suspected even existed. Not since the ride after the Battle of the Ruby Ford had he felt this way. He sensed something to one side and turned to see Frostfyre sitting there, watching him. There was something in her eyes that made him pause, an understanding and a knowledge. They had both killed a god. A mad god, a desperate thing of impulses and desires, a starving creature of darkness and night. But still a god. He looked at the huge direwolf and she looked back at him. And then they both nodded at each other. Life is for the living, he said quietly, before standing with a groan. There was a mirror on one wall, quite a fine one, by a table that had a bowl of water on it. He plunged his face into the water for a long moment, before straightening up and running his wet fingers through his hair and then looking at his reflection, before wincing slightly. There was a pale line, a scar, on his face, that ran from his right forehead, across the bridge of his nose and over his upper left cheek. That was from the blood of the drowned god. He was marked by the blood of a god. And then there was the pale line on the side of his torso that had been left by the blade borne by Euron Greyjoy. That should have been a fatal blow until Lord Hightower had sacrificed himself for him. He took a deep breath and then he looked about for a shirt and breeches. They were off to one side, southern style but finely made. As he dressed himself he cleared his throat and looked at the door. Attendants. Guards. There was a confused noise outside the door and then there was a brief knock on it, before it opened cautiously and a hesitant head poked through. It was one of his guards, Will by name. My lord. Are you well? We are well. Ned nodded at Frostfyre, who was watching them both. A leg of lamb for Frostfyre please, not too well done. And I need to break my fast. He stamped into a pair of boots and his stomach took that moment to rumble loudly. As I heard my lord Will grinned. He turned to the door. Ari. Lord Stark is awake. A leg o' lamb for the Lady Frostfyre. He turned back. Lords Tyrell and Hightower sent word that when you did awake, to meet them in the old Lord's solar. I can send food there, my lord. And the leg o' lamb. He repressed a sigh. Very well. Send word that I'm on my way. He paused as his stomach complained again. And can someone get me a honeycake to eat on the way? There were indeed 3 honeycakes that he ate on the way, Frostfear padding behind him with his guards, and as they passed along the halls of the High Tower he was aware of the way that those servants and others in the colors of House Hightower bowed as he passed. Will, he asked quietly as they strode up the stairs to what had been Lytton Hightower's solar. "Aye, my lord." "What word have you heard?" The guard tilted his head to one side and then licked his lips. "Word is spreading of what you did, my lord." "Killed a god, I mean." Well. Godslayer, some are calling you now. In the city, well, they call you the savior of Old Town. Godslayer. It made his bloody skin crawl. I did what had to be done, Will. Nothing more. I did my duty. Frostfear made a huffing noise to one side and Will looked at him oddly. As you say, my lord. As you say. When they made it to the closed door of the solar he could see by the way that the 2 guards in the tabards of House Hightower's eyes widened almost comically that they were surprised by his arrival. Then he paused. Will. My lord. How long was I asleep for? Almost 2 days, my lord. Gods. No wonder he was hungry. He looked at the guards at the door. Lords Hightower and Tyrell bade me come. The taller one to the right nodded hurriedly. Aye, my lord. He knocked on the door and then opened it. Lord Stark, my lords. Thank you, Will. Stay here, Ned muttered, before pausing slightly. And get that food, I beg of you, before my stomach meets my spine. I will, my lord. He stepped through into the bright and airy room that had been Lytton Hightower's solar. In it sat Baelor Hightower, now Lord Hightower, Willers Tyrell, who looked weary, and Samwell Tarly around a table, all looking up at him. And by the window stood Malora Hightower, her face drawn with sorrow. He blinked at that and then nodded somberly. Let me first say that I owe the late Lord Hightower a great debt. He saved my life. And I. Ned, if I may call you Ned, let me stop you there, Willers interjected with an upraised hand. He took a deep breath. Yes, grandfather gave his life to save you. But then you defeated Euron Greyjoy and saved my own life, which repaid any debt. And then your battle with and defeat of the drowned god left us deeply in your debt, Ned. There was a moment of silence. It was broken by Malora Hightower. He knew. What? Baelor Hightower asked, looking confused. I said that he knew. She passed a shaking hand over her forehead. There was a prophecy, if it can be called that. Ned felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. What prophecy? An inscription, Malora replied, picking up a piece of parchment and handing it over to Samwell Tarly, who looked at it and then tilted his head in puzzlement for a moment, before blinking hard and handing it over to him. He looked down at it. It was written in an archaic version of the language of the first men. A very archaic version. When the gate to the dark opens, he read out loud, and the plain talking one comes to fight the dying one, watch for the greedy one who desires to drink from the pool. There was another moment of silence. Plain talking means Stark, he said eventually. And the greedy one was Euron Greyjoy. He wanted to kill the drowned god, but, pool. Who knows what could be left behind by a dead god? Malora said in a quiet and bitter voice. Greyjoy must have thought, from what Willers has told us, that he could become a god himself by feeding on the corpse of the drowned god. The man was mad, Willers spat, his nostrils flared. Mad and raving. And dangerous. He broke those ancient wards made by our ancestors as if they were kindling. Getting out hurt him though, Sam Tarly muttered. Then he pulled a face. He left his skin behind when he fled. Then he's dead, Baelor Hightower insisted roughly, his fist beating on the table. No man can survive that. Ned sat down at the table and then looked at them all bleakly. Was he a man though? The way that he looked, the loose skin on his face, the things we know that he did to his crew, what is he now? Is he still a man? He said he'd been to Valyria. What happened to him there? Almost everyone that goes there dies or, in the rarest of cases like Arya Targaryen, comes back infected with something or somethings. And there were the tales of those that marched in and never came back. Demons were mentioned by some. Who knows what's there? Yet another silence fell, one that was punctuated with uneasy glances. Willers Tyrell broke it. The word of the death of the drowned god is only slowly spreading, but we already have a few messages from those areas afflicted by the blight. It is lifting, Ned. We await more news from the places that were afflicted, but the first word is good, of dried grapes that are refilling and grain that stands tall again. He let out a long sigh of part relief. Confirmation would be welcome of that. Welcome tidings at least. There was a knock at the door, which opened to reveal a number of servants in the livery of House Hightower, all bearing food on platters that made his mouth water and his stomach rumble. "I see that lunch has arrived," Ned Willers said with a smile. "It sounds like you are hungry." He was indeed, but he made sure that the leg of lamb went to Frostfire first. Then he took a massive bite of the chicken leg on the platter before him, before pausing and swallowing. "Samwell Tarly." The young man looked at him. "Lord Stark. You saved my life and that of Lord Tyrell. You stood between the gate and Euron Greyjoy." The heir to Hornhill looked intensely conflicted. I did, my lord. I was terrified at the time, so I don't. Only fools or madmen are never afraid when they go into battle. Kneel." Sam Tarly stood, his eyes very wide, and then he knelt. "The North does not have knights the way that the South does. But I, as Lord Stark, do declare you as a knight now. Rise, Sir Samwell. You have done well." Brynden. He'd wondered, as they rode for that crag, if the Green Man knew something about the place they were headed for that wasn't immediately apparent. And he was right. There was a path there, which led to a gully, which led to a dark cavern entrance that was big enough to ride into. From the rushes all over the cavern floor and the debris that had been piled outside the entrance, he could see that horses had been stabled in the cavern in the past. Refuge Crag was the name of the place. There were runes carved by the entrance, and as he got down off Wanderer and looked around, he could see that the place was larger than he had thought. The entrance faced south, which allowed light, even with the rocks in the gully outside, and he could see stacked firewood and more rushes off to one side. "There's a cleft in the wall over there that can be used as a fireplace," the Green Man said as he dismounted. "Sir Jaime, please light a fire. There's kindling and wood in here. The place has been used by both the Night's Watch and the Free Folk, sometimes even at the same time. I was told about it at Castle Black. It's a refuge." "It's warm," said Brian as she looked about the place, looking surprised. "The air's warm in here. Warm springs, further down. We'll need light though. Brynden, help me with the doors once the boy has got the fire going. And Brian, light a lantern or two please." "I'm not a bloody boy," the Kingslayer muttered as he knelt by the cleft and peered at it. "Ah. It's a hearth indeed." And then he started to lay a fire, somewhat clumsily, but with reasonably competent hands. As the Kingslayer used a flint and steel to light the kindling and then blew on it carefully, Brynden looked at the entranceway and then realized that there were indeed doors, two wooden frames on either side that could be moved into place, with what looked like wool held in place with wicker lattices. With the cavern starting to be lit by the fire and the lanterns, he joined the Green Man in shifting the doors to block the entrance, and just in time, based on the snowflakes that were pouring down outside and the howl of the wind. "Will we be safe in here?" Brynden asked quietly. "This place is known to so many. But the others?" The Green Man closed his eyes for a moment, before moving to one side and running his hand over some worn carvings on the left-hand side of the entrance. "This place is warded. It was fading before we came here. It's reinforced now." The hairs on the back of neck stood on end for an instant, and then he eyed the older man. "You just reinforced it?" "I did." "You felt it?" "I felt something." "As did I," Brian said as she approached them, lantern in one hand as she rubbed the back of her neck with the other. The Green Man smiled at them both. "You'll both do," he said. "Now unsaddle the horses and get them fed and bedded down." "Where will we rest?" the Kingslayer asked, looking confused. "Horses first," the Green Man admonished. "We can take care of ourselves." "They can't." The Kingslayer blushed a bit at this, but then unsaddled his own horse, rubbed her down and then fed her, as they each did the same to their own. "We'll need to keep the fire tended to," the Green Man rumbled as he eventually led them down along the corridor that led away from the cavern entrance. The rock walls were smooth, as if thousands of hands over the years had worked on them, and the path went down and opened up into a larger cavern. More rushes had been piled here and there, and by the light of the lanterns they could see that there was a great blackened cleft in one wall that had what looked like an unlit fire in it. There was a small pool to one side that was fed by a steadily dripping hole in the rock as well. Brindon lit it this time, using his own flint and steel. It was warmer in here, he could feel it, and the kindling was dry and went up without much effort. He could see logs peeled off to one side, dry ones, and he reminded himself to replace what they used. Yes, the Wildalar, free folk, were all to the south, beyond the wall, but that did not mean that this place might not be used again soon. There was even a pair of upwards angled metal rods that had been hammered into the rock on either side of the hearth, perfect to hang a chain for a cooking pot from, which was what he wanted to do. "I'll need water for the pot," he said as he unpacked a few things from his saddlebags. Then he paused. "Where's the warm springs?" "Further down." "Further down," said the green man as he unrolled a sleeping mat. "Over there." He followed the jerk of the thumb and soon discovered two things. The first was a carved set of holes in a horizontal slab that could only be a privy. The second was a path that led to the hot springs themselves. The air grew warm as he approached, and he undid his coat and then pulled it off entirely, before looking about. There were stalactites above him, about 20 feet or so, and a pool of water that must have been almost 50 or 60 feet across. There was steam rising from it in places, and he dipped one finger carefully in the water before sighing. Oh, that was warm, deliciously warm in fact. He filled the cooking pot half full and then walked back with thoughts of bathing in his mind. Supper was some dried beef that had been softened in the pot, along with carrots, potatoes and turnips, and some bread rolls that they dunked in the broth from the cooking to soften them up. There was little if any talking. The green man seemed to have his mind elsewhere, and the Kingslayer was either sulking or was thinking about something that demanded his complete attention. And as for Brian, she kept stealing little glances at him. That was possibly because he was doing the same with her. There was something there, a feeling, he couldn't put words to it. It was aggravating, something that gnawed at him at times. He could almost sense where she was at times. After they finished eating and cleaned their bowls in the pool, the green man sighed a little and then stood. "I'll check on the horses and then take the first watch." Brindon watched him go with a slight frown. And then he sighed a little himself. "And I," he said as he stood, "will take the second watch, but only after I have bathed. The warm springs beckon to me." The Kingslayer just nodded tiredly and kept staring into the fire, but Brian tilted her head in a number of directions and then blinked at him. "A warm bath is always good." There was something in her voice that sent a shiver down his spine, but he had no idea why. So he stood, grabbed a small bag from his saddlebag and strode off down the path that led down to the springs, lit by his lantern. He placed the lantern by the side of the cavern, stripped off and then strode into the pool, sighing as he felt the sensation of the warm water on his body. Before he'd entered the water he'd grabbed the lump of soap that he'd been able to access at Castle Black, and now he scrubbed himself as he bobbed up and down in the water. By the old gods, it felt good. The water was warm and it tasted clean. He didn't know where it left the caverns, but it must vent out somewhere. As he floated on his back and gazed up at the ceiling, he pondered on where the hot water came from. Was this a former fire mountain, like Dragonstone? A smaller one perhaps? How many more of them were there? "The water looks warm." The voice startled him. He didn't flounder, he was a Tully. But he brought his feet down and peered around. Brian was standing there on the stone path. She was wearing a shirt and breeches and her feet were bare. "It's warm indeed," he said in a low voice. She was looking at him and he met that gaze. There was something challenging in it and he suppressed a swallow as he felt his heart beat a bit faster. "You want a bath as well?" The word seemed clumsy, and he cursed mentally. A smile flickered across her face and then she started to undo her shirt. But as he gallantly started to turn away she stopped him with a single word, "Don't." He turned back and then watched as she stripped out of her clothes. Her breasts were pert and her thatch close cropped and as blonde as her hair. But he wasn't looking at that as he felt himself stir under the water. It was her face. Others might not call her beautiful, but he would. There was a flame inside her that he could almost sense. Once she was naked, she strode into the pool and then made her way towards him. Something seemed to have happened to his breath, and he could tell that she felt the same by the way that she licked her lips as she approached him. "I thought that I would come to you, as you had not come to me," she said eventually. I am older than you. The grey in your hair is gone now. I know, but I do not know why. I think that the path we are on has done that. Where does the path lead to?" And with that she smiled. "I do not know. But let us walk it together." And with that they both reached for each other, and her mouth was on his, and as he pulled her against him he made a note that the next day they'd find a heart tree somewhere and ask her great-grandfather to bloody well wed her. Ed Muir. He rode through the gateway of Riverrun with something of a song in his heart and a feeling that he hadn't felt in some time. He had a feeling that he was in love. It was a heady feeling. And a bittersweet one, in a way. Dismounting, he stroked the nose of Wanderer and then handed the reins to a groom, before looking around the courtyard. It was as busy as ever, perhaps a little busier, and he smiled slightly and then strode off to Father's solar. Father was looking into a cup of something that seemed to displease him when he rapped on the door and then walked into the room, but still smiled and waved him to a chair. As he sat, Ed Muir paused for a moment. Father looked tired. "A new tincture, from the Maester," Father said after a moment as he looked back at the cup. "Something to help." He tensed a little. "To help? With the pain?" A strained smile crossed Father's face. "The bad days are increasing, Ed Muir. There will come a day when they will outnumber the good days. And then, there will be the days when I cannot get out of bed." "Father." "No. Don't say it, Ed Muir. We need to acknowledge facts. I cannot honeycoat this. We know what's coming, this war on the wall, this war against the others and the dead. There's a winter coming of many years. And I am ill, and you must be ready to succeed me. And House Tully has grown thin, at least in those bearing that name. You are my heir, with Cat or one of her sons after you if the worst happens. We can't rely on Brynden marrying any time soon. Your uncle has ever been a man of whims. Although that might have changed now, with his association with the Green Men and this girl of Tarth." Father sighed and passed a hand over his brow. "I've met her, Father." Father looked up at him. "Roslyn Free?" Are you sure she's a Free? And his daughter?" Father laughed at this, a booming laugh that gave him a sliver of hope against the knowledge that Father was ill. "Oh, takes more after that Rosby mother of hers. You like her then?" He sat there for a moment, feeling the emotion within him at the memories of their meeting. "I do. Very much." "Good. Good." Father sat back and then sipped at the cup and then made a face. "Ah, that's foul in taste." He looked at him. "You wish to wed her?" "I do, Father." "Strange, to want to wed a Free. But she doesn't look like a Free. Which is a blessing." Father leant back in his chair and smiled. "Then we have a wedding to arrange, and right soon. I don't know how long I have left, but there must be more Tullys in Riverrun. There must. Winter is coming and there is so much to do." "I know, Father." He stood and strode to the window to look out. "It's going to be bad, isn't it?" Father threw the rest of the cup down his throat and then grunted as he levered himself out of the chair to join him. It is. The wall must stand. If the North falls, then we are next." He placed a hand on Father's shoulder. "Then I will tell Lord Free that I will marry his sister and that we have a marriage to arrange. The lords of the Riverlands can assemble to celebrate it and make ready for what is to come." Father grasped his hand. "And I'll try to live to see the birth of your heir. Send the ravens now." "Shella." There were times when she could sense that Harrenhal was restless. And if it seemed odd that anyone could describe a vast castle, parts of which could be said to be half melted from dragon fire, as restless, well, you had to have an ear out for the way it sounded at times. The sound of the wind in the corridors, or were those moans? So many had died in the castle, during its building and on that terrible day, when Balerion the Black Dread had burnt it on the direction of Egon the Conqueror. She looked at the fire in the fireplace of her room and shivered a little. Kingspire Tower was a place that she always avoided on certain days, such as the anniversary of the day that Harren the Black and his sons had died on that wretched tower. There was something about the place that more than put her teeth on edge, it frightened her at times. The place could be cold, eerie, echoing with odd sounds at times when there should be silence. And there was too much silence. She was the last of House Went. Her husband, Walter, was long dead, as were her 4 sons and 1 daughter. Or as good as dead. She sighed and forced her thoughts away from that subject. No word had or would ever come, unless that tiny, slender, hope faded and died before she did. House Went was the 6th house to have held Harrenhal since the death of Harren the Black. House after house had gutted and died in these halls. There was a curse, she was sure of it, and she had written to Cat, who would inherit after she died, to urge her never to set foot in the great castle, lest the curse touch House Stark as well. Perhaps the old gods would protect young Robb or Sansa or Bran if they were gifted it. Or perhaps not. She shivered again. There was something in the air tonight, something that was prickling at the edge of her senses, a ghostly touch of the skin, the sense that something was just beyond her vision, that if she turned her head fast enough she might see it but never could. She could not try. She was tired, deeply, almost deathly tired. Sighing deeply, she closed her eyes for a long moment and listened to the fire crackle. When she opened her eyes again, Walter was standing there in front of her, dressed in armor, a sword at his hip, grey in his hair as he had been in his last days. And he was looking at her with fondness and love in his eyes. "Shella, my wife and love." "Walter." She looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Is this a dream, or has my time come?" Walter went down on one knee in front of her. There was something in his expression that made her blink. There was regret there, but also fierceness. "No, your time has not yet come. And I will be fighting for that. And this is almost a dream, or close to it. Like Winterfell, Harrenhal is a place where the living and the dead are not far apart. In Winterfell it's because of great and wonderful magics. Here it's the opposite. Something terrible happened here. And tonight it ends." She shook her head in confusion. I don't understand." He reached out as if to take her hand for a moment, but then drew it back. "You were right, the curse is real. Very real. You were right to do what you did. Harren the Black, he's still here, in a way. The mortar used in the building of Harrenhal has the blood of thousands in it. That was deliberate. Harren was steeped in foul and black magics. He wanted to build something that would last the ages and continue his line. He was a necromancer, he used the dead for his own ends. Aegon the Conqueror was right to end him and his sons the way that he did, in fire. Harren would have cursed him and his family if he had had time. But he didn't. Instead, in those last moments of his life he cursed the castle. His body died but part of him remained. He leeches life from the families that own this castle. He's there, like a leech, always draining from the living. Draining us." She stared at him, horrified. "Then, how is it that you can now appear before me and tell me this?" Something moaned just out of sight and she looked about the room. Walter pulled a slight face. "I've always been here," he said eventually. "The spirits of the dead that Harren drained of life to keep that sliver of him alive are always here. Helpless. Silent. Impotent. Prisoners of that cackling madman. But how? Because he anchored his spells with the help of his mad, sick, dying god. The drowned god was a part of his power. And thanks to Ned Stark the drowned god is dead. Dead." The word seemed to echo oddly in the room for a moment. "The drowned god is no more. He's dead. The curse is unraveling, like a thread being pulled that destroys a dark and terrible tapestry. I know, we are free again." Her heart lurched within her and then a shape wavered out of nothingness and she gasped at the sight of Osric, her eldest son, also in armor but with his sword in his hand. "Father, we must strike now, he weakens." He looked at her and smiled a strained and mournful smile. "Hello, Mother. I've missed you so much. But it's time to go, Father. We have a battle to fight. And I want to sleep after." "Oh, Osric," she said, tears in her eyes. And then she looked at Walter, who was drawing his own sword. "If you win I'll never see you again, will I?" No, her husband replied with the same smile as their son. But we will be at rest. And Harin will be dead at last and the curse broken into pieces. More figures shimmered into view, all in armor and bearing sigils of houses that had all held Harren al after the death of Harin the Black. Walter looked at the grim-faced figures and then nodded to them. After they nodded back to him, he looked at her. I love you, my wife, always know that. Always. And now this ends, here and now. Harin finally dies tonight. The figures cheered at the final 4 words, and with that the host turned and walked through the walls and out of sight, in the direction of the Kingspire Tower. Just before Walter vanished from sight, he